Okay, the Article 32 closing arguments held on September 11th, 1970. The counsel for the government presenting the closing arguments was Captain Clifford Summers. Counsel for the accused, Bernie Segal, will present the defense's closing arguments. This hearing will come to order. Let the record reflect those parties that were present at the recess are currently in the hearing room. Is the counsel now ready to present the final argument? Yes, sir. Proceed, please. Sir, as a preparatory remark, I'd like to remind the investigating officer that the standards by which the evidence in this hearing is a standard less than that of reasonable doubt. Now to proceed to that point, I'd like to break my argument down into 2 points. First, I'd like to discuss the points of evidence which are of great significance insofar as the government is concerned. Secondly, to give the investigating officer an idea as to how we conceive the events of the 16th and 17th of February to have taken place. There are some obvious comments which can be made, the first of which would be that there is one person in the whole world undisputedly that had access to the house of Captain MacDonald on that night of the 16th. Him and the persons within it. Person obviously is Captain MacDonald. Whether there are other people is conjecture. We know that Captain MacDonald was there, and another obvious point, Captain MacDonald suffered injuries and whatever happened at the house in the morning of the 17th. Compare the injuries that Captain MacDonald suffered to those with his family suffered. This family, all the members were killed in a very brutal fashion. They were killed and overkilled. Captain MacDonald, on the other hand, suffered what, by comparison, can only be called superficial injuries. Any independent third party who committed such a crime and who fought with Captain MacDonald would, I submit, sir, not have left Captain MacDonald in the condition he was found in. Now, evidentiary points. Consider the first, the telephones. Each telephone in the house was handled by Captain MacDonald very soon, in time to the arrival of the military police. Now, we know when the military policeman handled the phone in the bedroom, and smudges appear on that phone. There are no fingerprints on the phone, and there are no fingerprints on the phone in the kitchen. There is no evidence whatever to show that the phone in the kitchen was tampered with in any way. There are no fingerprints on the phone in the kitchen. So, it is possible that Captain MacDonald was wearing gloves at the time that he used the telephone. Equally, it's possible that Captain MacDonald wiped those phones so that his bloody fingerprints, if he were not wearing gloves, would not appear thereon. There are no fingerprints on the knife which Captain MacDonald repeatedly removed from his wife's chest. There are smudges on that knife. Why smudges? Why not fingerprints? Since we know Captain MacDonald's hands at that time were probably bloody, we could perhaps expect plastic fingerprints, the kind which show without being dusted. Certainly we could expect very clear fingerprints. We don't have them. Smudges. Was Captain MacDonald wearing gloves when he pulled the knife from his wife's chest? Let's consider the bee blood in the kitchen. Now, there's appreciable sized spots of bee blood in the kitchen near the cabinet. Now, the issue, of course, can be raised that bee blood is bee blood. What does that mean? Bee blood could belong to anyone having bee blood who bled on that spot. That is true. But we have no evidence in that house other than the family was dealt blows such that they would be bleeding. And if there was no one else in that house, only the members of the family would have been bleeding. And we submit that the bee blood in the kitchen does indeed belong to Captain MacDonald. Now, why is it there near the kitchen cabinet? Well, I submit to you that its location near the cabinet is very handy to the location of the surgical gloves. I would point out also to you, sir, that not until Captain MacDonald testified to this, and at this hearing, he did provide He didn't provide any sort of explanation for the appearance of the bee blood that was in the kitchen. In fact, when questioned on April 6th, Captain MacDonald, when he was given the opportunity to state that he went further into the kitchen than the telephone, refused to accept the opportunity, maintaining that he did not do so. I suggest to you, sir, that since that time, Captain MacDonald has seen a good reason to have gone in there. Perhaps that accounts for his current explanation for the presence of bee blood. Now, let's consider the offense itself. Captain MacDonald, according to his story, was asleep on the couch. He was awakened to screams of his family, and found 4 people in the living room with him. Now, what does this necessitate? It means 4 people at least entered his house while he was asleep. That they did something to his wife, and Kimberly MacDonald. That because he remembers hearing them screaming. That they would be able to get at least into the living room before he awoke or was aware of their presence. It's rather odd, folks. Further suppose that the surgical gloves which perhaps his assailant were wearing, or the kitchen gloves, the heavy rubber gloves that he describes, his assailants were wearing. He describes that his assailants were wearing from his house. Suppose that some of those assailants not only got into the living room before they awoke him, but they also got in the kitchen. They rummaged around in the kitchen and appeared in the living room at the foot of his couch. Now, you've stood in that living room, sir. It's small, it's cramped, and it's crowded. It is difficult to believe if you had 2 people having the sort of struggle, let alone 4 people. Captain MacDonald says this took place in the living room. There just isn't room for it to happen. But assuming that it did happen that way, we have Captain MacDonald coming awake, struggling with 3 male assailants. A struggle which lasted long enough for him to get up, be knocked down, get up, and encounter a rain of blows, have his pajama top pulled over his head, and then finally wind up in the hall. Now, it is of extreme significance that Pamela Kalin was sleeping directly above that living room. Who says that she was not sleeping easily, and who remembers being awakened by one sound, heard no part of the struggle in the living room, and she just did not hear it. Why didn't she hear it? Well, sir, I submit to you, she did not hear it because it did not happen. Now let's consider for a moment the coffee table of that living room. The government does not really contend that the coffee table could not possibly have landed on its side. They do suggest to you, sir, that the odds of it landing on its side are very poor. We also suggest that the odds of it landing on its side with the contents underneath the edge of the table neatly stacked is just not possible. It raises the probability of that happening is practically 0. Presume that it did land on its side and obviously knocked over during the struggle. And we know, according to Captain MacDonald's story, that one of the assailants, the colored male, or was it 2 colored males? A colored male, at any rate, was standing between him and the coffee table. Perhaps he knocked it over. It's not a very stable coffee table on its side. It's odd that the struggle that continued to take place there did not displace, that the coffee table did not displace from its side to the top. It's also of interest to note, as part of the scene, we find Captain MacDonald's glasses. And on the lenses is a speck of blood. That's not bee blood. Where did it come from? Well, the defense would have you believe that the blood came from working in an emergency room the previous day or 2 days before. How is that likely? I suggest to you, sir, the blood got on those glasses while Captain MacDonald was in the process of committing the offenses which he is charged here today. Consider some of the other things. The dining room was in good order. Cards are standing up on the table and are still standing. The china cabinet, which was full of glassware and china and not too stable, seemed still to be full of glassware and china, undamaged. Yet 2 or 3 feet from it, 4 or 5 feet, this struggle took place. Now, Captain MacDonald describes the struggle as no big thing. It obviously happened quickly. But, It's a struggle between three people and himself, with obviously some force, with obviously some force and some stomping around involved. Why is that dining room in that condition? That is very hard to explain. MacDonald says he was kneeling near the edge of the couch at the north end of the couch and receiving a rain of blows. At least one of these blows he remembers was a good lick. Now, Captain MacDonald suffered two, apparently cutting wounds, one on his left abdomen and one on his right chest area, causing a pneumothorax. Perhaps he would have got these wounds in a struggle, but consider that these wounds are superficial. One of them doesn't go all the way through the skin, another was shallow enough, so the only thing that penetrated was the chest wall in a pleural cavity and perhaps the lung. Had it gone 2 to 4 more inches, a great deal more damage would have been done. Anybody fighting with Captain MacDonald and attempting to do him damage with the knife surely would have done a better job than that, particularly if Captain MacDonald's hands were still twisted up at the pajama top. Let's consider this too. 8 or 10 prick wounds that Captain MacDonald had received to his abdomen. It's interesting to note initially that although many people describe the wounds of Captain MacDonald received, and there's been some discrepancy between government witnesses, the defense witnesses, and as how to many wounds he received to the head, nobody but Captain MacDonald remembers these little puncture wounds on his abdomen. How did he get those little puncture wounds on his abdomen? Who knows? He doesn't know. He fell, and then he says he fell face down in the hall. He awoke face down in the hall, and I suggest to you, sir, this would lead one to the conclusion that if he had awoke in a position that he fell face first, which means that if you take his story, you have to believe that he got those 8 to 10 puncture prick wounds during a rain of blows. Now that is a marvelous touch. A man with an ice pick or a knife who is capable of delivering not 1 or 2 or 6 but 10 blows with this instrument, which merely break the skin, which indeed prick the skin so superficially that they weren't even seen in the emergency room by the people who seen him that morning. So how about those prick wounds? Well, this brings us to the issue of the pajama top. The pajama top is of critical significance. You've seen for yourself, sir, that pajama top had numerous small round holes in it. Now, how did they get there? I suggest, sir, that those small round holes, those small round holes got there while it was on the chest of Mrs. MacDonald, and I suggest that these 8 or 10 puncture wounds that Captain MacDonald describes were invented to help explain why there are small round holes in his pajama top. And I suggest to you, sir, that it doesn't really do that, since many of those holes on the back of the pajama are in the back of the pajama top. You've seen it for yourself, sir. That pajama top has numerous small round holes in it. Now, how did it get those small round holes? I suggest that it got those small round holes while it was on the chest of Mrs. MacDonald. And I suggest, too, that these 8 or 10 puncture wounds that Captain MacDonald describes were invented to help explain why there were small round holes in his pajama top. And I suggest to you, sir, that it really doesn't really do that, since many of those holes are in the back of the pajama top. Now, there seems to be some indication that the defense might want to contend that the holes in the pajama top, as Captain MacDonald having it around his wrist, was defending himself. Very good. If that's the case, with the size of those little round holes being very clearly the size of a shaft of an ice pick and not the point of the ice pick, that Captain MacDonald should have some rather severe wounds on his hands or his wrist, and he doesn't. Now, what about Mrs. MacDonald and the pajama top? The pajama top was put on top of Mrs. MacDonald by Captain MacDonald. He said so. He let the government believe, and we believe, that Captain MacDonald put that pajama top on top of her. We also believe that he methodically, with an ice pick, punctured the chest of his wife, unfortunately also puncturing the blue pajama top. Now, the pajama top obviously was ripped during the time of the struggle. It trails numerous strings. Even today, it trails numerous strings. You've seen it yourself this morning. You know that it just drips these little bitty strings. Obviously, then, we can expect that there will be many of these little bitty strings in the living room where the thing was torn, according to Captain McDonald, right? No, I'm sorry, there aren't any there in the living room. That's not where you can find these little bitty strings. The vast majority of the strings found, call them fibers, call them what you will, we found them in the master bedroom, and I suggest to you, sir, that although this pajama top drips these little bitty strings, it doesn't leave too many of them around. I suggest to you, sir, that it would have to shed the greatest number of them at the instance when it was torn. And I suggest to you, sir, that the evidence clearly shows that the pajama top was torn in the master bedroom. And incidentally, where we find the pajama top in the master bedroom, that gives us another little problem. Several of these fibers were found under the body of Mrs. MacDonald. But that's a little strange because Mrs. MacDonald was substantially in place when Captain MacDonald went to check her, according to his story. And although he shifted her a little bit, he doesn't indicate that he moved her any great amount. And I suggest to you, sir, that he did not move her any great amount. Then how did the pajama top strings get under Mrs. MacDonald since she was already in the lying position before Captain MacDonald even got into the bedroom? And that's easy to say, sir. The pajama top was torn in the bedroom. It was torn while Colette MacDonald was still alive. It was torn in a struggle between Colette MacDonald and Captain MacDonald, and that explains it. Captain MacDonald's theory does not explain it. He cannot explain it, not even if we assume that one or two threads fell off of that pajama top underneath Mrs. MacDonald at the time that Dr. Neal either did or did not shift her, because they are found from her head in the leg area, and they could not have all dropped into these various areas during the shifting of the body, by which, by the way, I do not believe happened. I don't believe Mrs. MacDonald was shifted in that manner. However, regardless of whatever it was or not, I contend to you, sir, that these things did not and could not have gotten there in any other fashion, in any other way than I just described it. Now, here's another interesting fact to be noted. The fibers of the pajama top, we found one of them under the Kristen MacDonald's fingernail. How in the world did it get under Kristen MacDonald's fingernail? Captain MacDonald had taken his pajama top off in the master bedroom. Now, admittedly, he was still wearing his pajama top bottoms. He was still wearing his pajama bottoms, and we know where they were torn. And incidentally, sir, I suggest to you that the pajama bottoms were torn at the same time the top was, because who would wear a pajama bottom which was torn in that manner otherwise? And if it had been torn in that manner at some point prior to the night of the 17th, washings would have probably taken care of the stray fibers, which might otherwise fall. So how did that little fiber get under Kristen's fingernail? I don't believe, sir, that a fiber will fall underneath someone's fingernail. A little bit of fiber floating around is not likely to do that. How did they get there? I suggest to you, sir, that it got there while Kristen MacDonald was still alive, while she was clutching. And remember, sir, she has numerous wounds to the hand. You know, wounds to the hand, as though she were attempting to protect herself, to reach out. And I suggest to you, sir, that she did reach out. She encountered the garment of her assailant, and her assailant was Captain MacDonald. And that, sir, is how that fiber came to rest underneath the fingernail of Kristen MacDonald. I suggest to you, sir, there are many factors which do not add up independently or in conjunction with the story that Captain MacDonald tells of that evening. Now, sir, Captain MacDonald was assaulted, according to his story, by 3 men and 1 woman. Did she have muddy boots? Well, it was raining outside that part of the evening in the early morning hours. We know that the MPs tracked grass and debris when they came into the house. And we also know that the first MP entered the house and said no mud, grass, or debris were in the master bedroom. And there's plenty of light in the master bedroom. Sir, the MPs also say that there was none of this material in the living room where you would expect it had these 4 people been in that room where Captain MacDonald was, and as Captain MacDonald described. Now, the light is not as good in there as in the master bedroom, that's true, but these people said that they could see, and they didn't see any debris. They were not there. Now, Captain MacDonald, according to his story as to what happened that night, he fell in the hall. That in itself is a little difficult to understand because he was facing the hall. And you've been in that house, sir, and you know the relationship between the couch and the hall. You can't just fall from the end of the couch into the hall. It can't be done. How did he get in the hall? And if he's in the hall, why don't we have a puddle of bee blood at the end of the hall? The hallway, the steps leading to the hallway, which is in between the living room and the bed and the living room and the hallway. That entrance. Why is there bee blood there? Well, one thing you could say, sir, is if you were the defense, you could say, well, his pajama top, wrapped around his hands, and he fell on his hands, and the wound bled on the pajama top, But yeah, you could say that, and I would expect there to be some blood in the hall. But it's interesting that the first time that version was said was right here. That had never came up before. He hadn't mentioned it before, but that's how he explains it, and that's odd. What did Captain MacDonald do when he left the kitchen, having washed his hands? What did he do? He doesn't remember. Well, maybe he doesn't remember, but it's odd, though, that he doesn't specifically remember leaving and going back to the bedrooms in one of his prior statements. And, of course, it's odd that Captain MacDonald tells us that he remembers these events better now than he did on the 6th of April. Maybe so. It's a little odd, very hard to understand, and interesting that what he remembers now is a great deal more beneficial than what he remembered then. Now, why would 4 people, strangers to the house, strangers to the MacDonald family, leave a scene in the living room which has such a very high probability of staged? What for? What for? And there's no reason why they should do that. Who has a reason to stage what happened in the living room? Well, Captain MacDonald has a reason, because it didn't happen there. Did not happen in that living room. Does MacDonald have a reason? Because it didn't happen there, and he has to explain also, why is there AB blood on the Esquire magazine, which is underneath a box, which is underneath the table? AB blood. That's that's Kimberly's blood type. That's odd. Did Captain MacDonald give all the members of his family mouth-to-mouth resuscitation? Yeah. Yes, he did. He said it so here. Of course, he didn't say that before. He didn't say that before, but he says it here. Was he walking, crawling? How was he getting around? Well, it's confusing, and it's understandable that under any circumstances it would be confusing, but it is just one more confusing thing. It's just one more confusing thing. Finally, before I go into the theory of the government as to what happened on that evening, how many Negroes were in that group that assaulted him. Special Snowman, who was in the emergency room, heard Captain MacDonald describe 2 Negroes, 1 white and 1 white male. And oddly enough, that's the description that went out on the air by the MPs. So that's odd. Now, what happened that night? What kind of theory would explain all these odd, inconsistent little bits of evidence? I give you, sir, at least one, and I would, to belabor it, I could give you three or four basic variations, but I don't think that's necessary. So let me give you one. I think, sir, that the early evening hours of the 16th occurred as Captain MacDonald said they did. There's no reason to believe otherwise. There's no other evidence to the contrary. We know that Mrs. MacDonald went to her class. We know from other students she was there. We know from one witness that she drove home with, and I believe too, sir, that Mrs. MacDonald went to bed first, and I also believe that Kristen got in bed with her. Now, what about Kristen getting in bed? What's the significance of that? Well, they talked about it before, and they had some minor disagreement as to what to do about it. And somebody had wound up sleeping on the sofa or in somebody else's bed before on this account. Kristen, I believe, wet that bed. And there is in that bed what appears to be a urine stain. Up to that point, I believe Captain MacDonald, because there is no independent evidence which would show me a reason not to. And then I think things begin to go astray from what Captain MacDonald said happened. He went in that bedroom. He found his wife asleep. He found Kristen in the bed with her asleep, having wet the bed. And I believe he took Kristen back to her own bed. And he put her in her bed along with the bottle, which we know from the pictures wound up on her bed. But I don't believe Captain MacDonald went to the couch. What I think he did do is say, "Hey, wake up. And then what do you want?" Colette probably said, and then Jeff said, "Kristen went to bed, and I told you we should have put her in her bed. Somebody's gonna go to the couch. Go." Now, am I contending what I conceivably contend? Would the government contend that because Kristen MacDonald wet the bed, Captain MacDonald killed his wife? No, it's the beginning of an argument. It starts. What does Mrs. MacDonald do? She says, "No, I am not getting out of the bed. You sleep on the couch." If you want somebody to sleep on the couch, and an argument ensues. Perhaps it got a little heated. Mrs. MacDonald gets out of the bed, raises her voice a little bit. Remember, this is the far end of that apartment. It's the area where Pamela Kalin says she can't hear things from that end. That is the nearest thing to do. That's the nearest thing to it. It is often another building 15 feet away. So it's not odd that nobody would have heard an argument of this nature. What happened? What I think happened is that it got more heated and more heated. Perhaps Mrs. MacDonald slapped Captain MacDonald. Now, what kind of man is Captain MacDonald? He's action-oriented. He's proud. He has a great deal of masculinity stored up, and he's a trained athlete and boxer. What happens? He slaps. Whap! He slapped back, and possibly, even without a second thought, reflex, whap! Then we got the physical contact. What happens? Mrs. MacDonald reaches out with her right hand, scrapes him. And in doing so, she put some little puncture marks on his chest, and she tears at the pajama top right down to the center of it. And she tears the pajama pocket right off. And Captain MacDonald hit her, and she comes up fighting. Now, it's possible she came up with a knife first, and it's possible, had she not done that, things might have been otherwise. That's a possibility. She's frightened, has a knife perhaps. Maybe she waves it at him. Possibly she inflicts that little scrape wound on him. The one that's on the left abdomen. And that does it. Now he's losing his conscience, his control, to his action orientation. And he picks up a piece of lumber. Now, what about this piece of lumber? What about it? It's got paint on it. Apparently, of the same type that has been used around the house. He's been building a lot of things, shelves and things like that. It's a size that could be used to prop up a window. The children play with the lumber, so it's not unusually necessary that the lumber to have been there. It's not unusually necessary in the view of the nature of the clutter in that house that perhaps a paring knife was present. He picked up the stick having just been hit, or perhaps threatened with a knife, and he beat his wife with it. And she has the wounds on her forearms where whoever beat her, she was fending it off with her forearms. And with each strike of that stick, he gets angrier and angrier and losing all control in a blind, fantastic, mindless rage. In the tragedy of tragedies, Kimberly MacDonald, having heard that commotion, enters the bedroom and, standing in the doorway, says something like, "Daddy, what is happening?" And in a blind rage, without thinking, he inflicts great harm on whatever object he struck. Captain MacDonald simply swung around and smashed her skull and swung again. And maybe, just maybe, she fell in the doorway where we have a patch of AB blood. And it's like, my God, what have I done? I believe he loved his children, and I do not believe that in any contemplative mood he would have inflicted harm on them. And he sees what he's done, and it's just like cold water then. What in God's name have I done? He's a doctor. It doesn't take too long to discover Kimberly's skull is smashed. His wife is lying there, with her forearm smashed, her head beaten open. He reaches. He takes the bedclothes off the bed, picks up his daughter, and carries her to the bedroom. He places her on the bed, carefully tucking her in the covers. Remember, sir, that is the way Kimberly was lying in that bed. She could not have been injured as she was, because she was lying on one of those bruises. And even if she had been struck in the bed, lying face up, it would almost be impossible to inflict the bruises she had. I submit to you, sir, she was not in the bed when she was struck. And he takes those bedclothes and he wanders into the living room, where he just drops them. And he drops them at the kitchen, where we have smears of A and AB blood in its location. Where did the A blood come from? Splattered, perhaps, from his wife's beating. And he sits on the couch and he puts up his heads and hands and he says, my God, what will I do now?" Dr. MacDonald could have easily known that. And what can he do now? He can call the MPs, but what happens then? He's got to tell them what happened. He just can't tell them that. He's got to tell them what happened, and he can't tell them that some hippies came in and beat up two of them and left them alone, and him alone and Kristen alone. No, he can't tell them that. He's got to tell them that. He can't tell them that. He's got to tell them the truth. He spent all his life becoming a doctor. Success is a driving motivation in Captain MacDonald. He will lose everything he's fought for throughout his life if he does that. If he tells the truth, it'll happen. He is guaranteed to become a useless derelict to society. If he calls the MPs and tells them what happens, he can commit suicide. I submit to you, sir, that this is not the man to commit suicide. This is a man with a life drive. If you listen to the psychiatrist of insurmountable power, this is a man who will simply not commit suicide. Suicide is the ultimate failure. What else can we do? There's other things he can do. He can kill the rest of the family. He can inflict some injuries on himself. He can inflict injuries on himself. And he can say, oh, somebody else did it. It's happened recently. We know it's happened recently. He knows it's happened recently. He discussed the Manson case. And even if he hadn't, no intelligent, educated human being alive in February 1970 in the United States of America did not know about those killings. Now that's a horrible, horrible thing to do. And it's a horrible thing to say anybody could have done it. But what does a man in this situation that we contend Captain McNaught found himself in at the point to do three choices. He can either take two of them, he goes to the kitchen, he acquires some rubber gloves, he acquires a paring knife, he left the other one in the master bedroom, and he perhaps first goes to Kimberly, knowing that she might be in grave pain and danger. Who knows? We don't know. But he does go to one of the children and he stabs them. And there's no great mutilation of these bodies. These aren't great X carved in their chest and their toes. And their toes are not killed off. They're killed. That's the main mutilation. He winds up in Kristen's room. Who knows what state of mind? Grieving, crying, who knows? With this knife, he stabs Kristen. He stabs her, and he reaches up. She's stabbed in the hands. She acquires one of the tattered fibers under her fingernail. And lo and behold, the wife comes in. He hits her. She falls to the bed. She bleeds there, having already been beaten and having her skull opened up, where the scalp bled profusely. And she bleeds all over the top part of the bedsheet. And that, sir, is where we can find great stains of A blood, Colette MacDonald's blood. He takes his wife back to the master bedroom. He stabs her. He returns to Kristen's bedroom, turns her over, stabs her some more. What did he do? What did he do then? He could have done a lot of things in that order. I'm not sure of. And I don't know how much it matters. But at this point, he goes into the master bedroom and he cleans up. Now, I submit, sir, that what he did was he made those phone calls. And then he realized, I've still got the gloves on. Now, at some point, in an effort to be consistent with his story, he used the first two fingers of his right hand to write pig on the headboard. It was an A blood. Perhaps it was then, I suggest, sir, that he at some point consulted the Esquire magazine, which is why there's A blood, B blood on it. He made the calls. Perhaps he still has the blood-soaked rubber gloves on, quickly wiping the phones, tearing off the rubber gloves, distributing the fragments about the master bedroom. At some point, he goes to the master bathroom and he cleans up. Now, I submit, sir, he made those phone calls, and then he realized, I've still got the gloves on. Now, at some point, in the effort to be consistent with the story, he has used the first two fingers of his right hand to write pig on the headboard, which was an A blood. Perhaps it was then, I suggest, sir, that at some point he consulted the Esquire magazine, which is why there's AB blood on it. He's made the calls. Perhaps he still has the blood-soaked rubber gloves on. Quickly wiping the phones, tearing off the rubber gloves, distributing the fragments about the master bedroom, rushing to the master bathroom, washing his hands, flushing down the glazed gloves. What about his wound? Well, at some point along in there, I suggest to you that he inflicted it on himself, because it's possible that his wife inflicted the wound which caused the pneumothorax, but I think not. Not at all. I think he did it himself. I think he did it very carefully, holding the blade between his fingers, like aiming it at an apparent valuable spot upwards, and stabbed himself and flopped on the floor and waited for the MPs. And that, sir, essentially is the way Captain Jeffrey R. MacDonald became a murderer. Thank you. This hearing will recess for 5 minutes. The hearing was gaveled out and recessed at 1142 hours on September 11th, 1970. The hearing then reopened at 1150 hours on September 11th, 1970. The hearing reopened for the Article 32 hearings, the closing arguments, and we reopened at 1150 hours. On September 11th, 1970, the defense counsel presented their closing arguments, which would be Bernie Segal. Okay. This hearing will come to order. Let the record reflect that those parties who are here in attendance at the recess are currently in the hearing room. Proceed, Counsel. With the investigating officer's permission, I would like to dwell for a few minutes on what I think are certain appropriate rules that are going to necessary to guide this investigation in arriving at the conclusion that it must bring about. I do not suggest to you that the burden of proof is facing the investigation is whether or not the government has produced the case beyond a reasonable doubt. We have researched this matter in an attempt, first of all, to help us determine our analysis of the case and presentation we will make to you. What standard we are using in measuring the evidence and therefore being able to argue to you whether or not the government's evidence has achieved the standard or not. I am of the opinion, sir, and I will share with you the reasons why I am of the opinion that taken on every single known standard, the government's case meets none. Now, if the government standards are running, there is no burden of proof that exists whatsoever on the government at all the way through the highest standard that we observe in crucial criminal matters, which is beyond proof of a reasonable doubt. We find no standard with the government's case has been achieved. But I don't think the standard in this case is no burden of proof on the government at all. It seems perfectly clear from the decisions of the United States Court of Military Appeals, which in this particular proceeding has had the most opportunity to reflect upon the nature of the Article 32 investigation, but also a reflection of the decisions by the United States federal courts dealing with the federal criminal procedure and dealing with constitutional rights which may apply both military and civilian persons, that we can find with some guidance as to where are the applicable standards. Now, in several cases, the Court of Military Appeals has discussed what an Article 32 proceeding is. And a matter of fact, it has had the occasion to make reference to the definition of what an Article 32 proceeding is in one of the collateral proceedings brought by the counsel for the accused. The court has reiterated its previous position that this is akin to a combination of a preliminary hearing and a grand jury inquiry. Now that takes perhaps a slight amount of explanation as to what the two really represent in the federal criminal law, because again, I think that it is what the federal court of appeals patterns itself after when it seeks guidance or seeks other decisions. The courts when it has none of its own to look at. Now, that takes perhaps a slight amount of explanation as to what the two really represent in the federal criminal law, because again, I think that is what the federal courts pattern themselves after, and that's what the Court of Military Appeals patterns itself after when it seeks guidance or seeks other decisions of other courts when it has none of its own to look to. And it looks to what the federal courts say, and the matter of fact, an analysis of the military law system at this level, and at the level of the initiating stage, there are a great many parallels to the federal criminal procedure. There is only one aspect I perceive of an Article 32 proceeding that is really akin to a grand jury proceeding, is the one that says this court or inquiry rather than a court of inquiry may bring before its persons to give all types of information that is evidence which would not normally be directly relevant to and directly germane. For instance, I would categorize the testimony just for a moment to address myself. Mrs. Daw is not being directly relevant or germane to the inquiry in the Mad Dog case itself, but it has some collateral value in terms of establishing nature of certain activities in drugs in this community, which Fort Bragg is a part of, and therefore it does shed certain amount of background on the sidelight on the problem.
Now, in a preliminary hearing, there is no conceivable way that any counsel for either side could establish relevance for the materiality of that kind. The testimony, and it would not have been admitted. By the way, it is not only this type of evidence in this case that has come in like that, but rather too fringe in the area of the inquiry we are making. But in a grand jury investigation, grand jury brings before it many persons to educate it. So the grand jurors, who are in a sense, like the investigating officer, not judges or lawyers, but they are persons who have a specific criminal law assignment and may understand the context, the middle, like you, if you please, in which they are functioning. So they may then apply that the background to understanding of the specifics in any given case. I think that is a substantial parallel to the grand jury procedure. I think also, sir, by the way, the right of the investigating officer to close these proceedings is in a sense much akin to a grand jury investigation. Grand jury investigators are not held in the presence of even the accused, which we do here. But otherwise, what goes on in a grand jury proceeding is not open to the public or the media. And again, the extent of the court has affirmed the right of this inquiry to close it. Has adopted one of the aspects of an investigating grand jury, the grand jury proceedings. There's one other matter that probably akin to a grand jury proceeding, and that is in fact, the grand jury itself controls what goes on. Although the government counsel in this proceeding and the accused counsel, in effect, the final decision can be made by the investigating officer as to what he will hear and not hear, and he wishes to be brought in where normally in a trial or a preliminary hearing, the magistrate or other officer who hears the preliminary hearing would not normally direct the nature of the inquiry or direct the clearing of issues, and is in this case we are in fact investigating and using a grand jury parallel. Now, on the other hand, as far as I can perceive it, sir, another aspect of this case identical to a federal preliminary hearing is held before the United States Commissioner. That is, we do in fact have the accused present here, which in the grand jury proceeding the accused is never allowed in a grand jury room except in the one very rare occasion when he himself might agree to be a witness, and then he is excused and does not hear anyone else's testimony. We are different from a grand jury in the sense that we have counsel here for both parties at all times, and which is not in a federal grand jury proceeding. We set about to prove certain set of given facts or present testimony and witnesses. In effect, the government tries to sway away the investigating officer that it has sufficient evidence to justify the investigating officer recommending the case be held for court-martial, and that is exactly what the function of a commissioner or magistrate performs. When he hears the case, he makes no final determination of guilt or innocence. As a matter of fact, in most instances, he is concerned only with the government's evidence alone. Is enough to, on its surface, to require that the case be held before a grand jury, but does not pass upon the fundamental question of guilt or innocence. Now, good, to this extent, the proceeding is very much a parallel to that. The question is, the government persuaded the investigating officer that it has enough evidence to go forward. We have here, however, an additional feature, and that is the feature that is not available in all preliminary hearings. In the state's courts' preliminary hearings, interesting enough, we do not allow defendants in murder cases to offer any testimony. We simply say, does the prosecution tell us enough to persuade us of the two facts? One is prima facie. That is, it's on its face. Does it appear that there was a felonious death here? And secondly, does it appear that there is that's reasonably clear on the basis of just hearing the prosecution evidence that the accused committed the crime, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but does it appear clearly on its face. Now it seems we are largely aching on all points with the preliminary hearing procedure. On that point, a parallel, for instance, of federal preliminary hearings, the rules of hearsay and evidence do not apply exactly as we function here. That is, in a federal preliminary hearing, we would regularly have FBI agents or other investigative agents come and testify as to the statements of other persons, or although very germane and very direct in matters, in fact, it is very impossible in a federal preliminary hearing to not have the witness present, but to have an agent go as far as to read the person's testimony. That is permissible. We follow it, and again, it was allowable under the rules of the case set down by the Military Court of Appeals, a procedure which says that we will allow hearsay in our judgment, and we think that helps the investigation. But also, this inquiry has been an unusually thorough one. We have largely tried to avoid hearsay, but it was reasonably possible to produce the live witnesses. But again, I make the point at this juncture that it is akin to a preliminary hearing. That leads me to conclusion, sir, that the standard is most applicable, that is the one that I think would really conclude is the one that guides this inquiry, and the one which should be applicable to this inquiry. Has the government persuaded the investigating officer that it has established a prima facie case against Captain Dr. Jeffrey R. McDonald? That is, on its face, the government has shown, 1, a felonious killing. Well, nobody in this case has the slightest hesitation about that. We know that there were 3 felonious killings, but the government has established clearly that it appears on its face that Captain McDonald has committed these offenses, clearly on the face of it. Captain McDonald has presented these offenses. Not beyond a reasonable doubt, I haven't said that, but giving the government the benefit of the open testimony is to say the credibility of the witness, let's say, or assume that the government witnesses are credible. Let's give the government every favorable influence we can reasonably do. Their witnesses are clearly shown to be wrong. Therefore, the government no longer has the benefit of that. But on the aspect of the witness testimony, the inquiry officer should say to himself, well, assuming looking at the government evidence in a favorable light to the government, considering whether the witnesses, of course, was impeached or contradicted by someone who no longer makes them credible in your eyes, but considering that the government has persuaded the investigating officer that on its face, that it appears clearly, it appears without the necessity for struggle, conjecture, and indentation, that in fact there is clear reason, apparent reason to conclude that Captain Jeffrey R. McDonald committed these murders. Now I do believe that there is no single case that will state this to you, sir. I do believe that there is no single case that will state this to you, sir. All I can say to you is on the analysis of this case, I think this is a clear rule of law that should be implied. I would certainly prefer if the investigating officer was to adopt, for instance, the more stringent standard of the court-martial, that the more stringent standard of the criminal proceedings, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. But I haven't the slightest hesitation to say to you that this case could not even get to the point of the defense being offered because it would not meet the standard. No matter whether that standard is applied or one that I think is more appropriate, one of the prima facie standard, it doesn't meet. The government case doesn't meet that. You can only get any standard in between if you can contrive a standard lesser than that. If you do any standard at all, I am satisfied that we can show you the analysis of all the facts that have fallen, that the government has not met any reasonable standard it can establish for it. The only standard that we can allow is the investigation to recommend, in view of the evidence, at least Captain Jeffrey R. McDonald be held for court-martial, would be a standard to say that have no burden of proof whatsoever, and they established a murder and they don't know who committed it. They don't know the answers to a great many questions, some small and some large, and therefore, because they don't know the answers, there ought to be a man's life placed in jeopardy for triple homicide. I doubt very much whether this inquiry, after viewing, and I think that the law, as we understand it, would conclude that they have no burden of proof. I think we have gotten to the point where we can now review the facts and compare them to these various burdens now. And I want to say one thing, that I will try my best, sir, in every fashion that I know, to refer to the accuracy of the record and refer accurately to what I believe. The witnesses have what we have had, in my judgment, in my experience, the longest Article 32 investigation as far as the numbers of weeks spent in actual hearings that I have ever become aware of. I know of no recorded case, frankly, where there is more time spent. Therefore, if I inadvertently mistake something, or if your recollection is different than mine on what the facts are, I trust that the inquiry will give me the benefit of the doubt of the unintentional statement. And I will seek, to the best of my ability, to bring together the facts as accurately as I can. But in advance, I say, if I err, if your recollection is different than mine, it's not within any intention to mislead the inquiry. I want to make one other observation, if I may, before talking about the analysis. I have a very real feeling, because we are in military context, that in one of the other parallels that we might draw to the way we are functioning, to the way you must ultimately make a conclusion, is to think, I think, the development of an intelligence operation. That this is, if we view the entire proceedings that we have been sitting through as a command seeking to have the staff and other field officers come before it and bring together the bits and pieces of intelligence, some remote, some close, and some in depth, some less in depth, some for good people and some for less competent people, but because the command has to make a decision based upon intelligence which will commit the life of one of its members to possible death. I think I might say that in advance of even more analysis of the record, that I think one might say that in the evidence in advance of even more analysis of the record, that I think that the commander would have an enormous difficulty to say, on the basis of the facts laid before him, that he could in good conscience justify thereafter to himself or any other authority having committed the life of a member of his command on the basis of what he's been laid before him. It seems that no command would take the definitive step, that no command would say, well, all right, let's make it clear enough to me that I can now make a command decision in which I recognize life is at stake, not merely time or money, but life is at stake. I think this is the kind of background that we keep in this, because we have seen the development of all kinds of intelligence without, I think, the meeting that kind of standard, which I think the commander would have to apply. Now, we have had here for over 3 weeks to find out what has been the government's theory of how this took place, how this crime took place, and how did Captain McDonald commit these crimes. As a matter of fact, I have listened to the testimony as we've gone through it week after week at various times. The theory seems to me have changed. It seems to me there have been some different suggestions whether Captain McDonald killed all 3 persons in the house as far as the government is concerned, or whether Captain McDonald killed 2 of the persons in the house, or one of those persons in the house. It seems to me the matter of the fact that it was a great error from the very beginning of the government did not elect to tell us on its opening address what the theory that they were going to proceed under. That is, the government simply said that they were going to prove that Captain McDonald did this, and I'm going to point out to you within a moment or two, sir, one of the most important things that the government contended it would prove by statement of the government counsel at the opening of its case, which is the record of this case, which did not prove, and yet it has gone on at great length in this theory that is announced at the end of 5 weeks as to how this happened, without ever having proved what is one of the most fundamental underlying facts that they say they would prove in advance of this, which would remain some value in helping the investigating officer determine whether or not the government in fact has proven anything all to resemble the theory that they have argued here today. Now, in my own review, I didn't have the benefit of the government's theory in advance and have waited for all this time to arrive. And I want to explain why I've organized my material in this way simply because it ought to not be viewed by the investigating officer as a failure to respond to the government's case, because I did not know how they intended to proceed until we actually heard the government counsel's final words. It seemed to me it was advisable to make an intelligent presentation to the investigating officer, and it would be that I should presume certain intelligent assumptions of how an police investigator, detective of a homicide case would have worked this case. And therefore, he contrived some rather ridiculous ideas of how one might guess or presume the case took place. I sought to find out what the mind of an intelligent detective would think in this case, and I found that there were conceivably 4 theories that the prosecution could have proceeded under, and in fact, in listening to the final remarks this morning of the government's counsel, I found that they picked up at least 2 or 3 of those theories trying to explain how Captain Medon committed the crimes. The 4 theories that I thought an intelligence investigator might bring to this matter, as he had hoped to uncover the evidence to bring an inquiry like this would be one. There's one, that Captain Medon killed all 3 members of his family in a premeditated homicide, and that he was sane at the time he did it. The second theory is Captain Medon killed all 3 members of his family upon impulse without premeditation. The third theory is Captain Medon committed all 3 of the crimes when he was insane temporarily. And the fourth theory on the case, I gathered it, only remoting suggesting I have heard from the government's counsel, and some suggestion through the witnesses was in fact Colette was responsible for some of the deaths, but that Captain Medon was in turn responsible for her death. It seemed to me all these covered of the possible logical approaches evaluating, and therefore I ask you to take the liberty to present my review of the evidence in that regard. I will, at the conclusion of my analysis of what I thought were the 4 theories, treat some of the specifics that were brought up in the government's new theory announcing this morning, which seems to me spread equally over several of the individual theories I have set forth. Now, doing this, sir, I have found, for my own edification, for the purpose of not losing train of thought and not being unnecessarily redundant, although the theories that will in fact be redundant in points, each theory involves overlapping review of the same evidence, and I would like to use this chart here, and I trust that the government's counsel will put themselves in a comfortable position so that they may see it, and if they care to observe any of the notations I make.
Next, Bernie Segal placed upon an easel a display of an example of a theory of why Jeffrey R. McDonald might have done the murders, and he was going to debunk it. So we continue with Bernie Segal.
The reason why one might suspect at some point that the government would pursue this and of the theory was one, they have no evidence of insanity, extraordinary impulsive behavior at any time. And a great deal of the questions of the government's witnesses was to show that MacDonald was rather bright, rather calm, cool, and under difficult conditions. Therefore, the picture of a killer under the theory number 1 would be a very intelligent, much more than the average homicide committer. Very intelligent, cool, calm, and able to think and analyze because of the substantial amount of education, personality, training to indicate dealing quickly with situations, and that this is the kind of individual that could pull for premeditated intentional murder. And in fact, the latter part of the government's summary this morning was in the killing of the second child, in fact, Mrs. MacDonald's final killing. That is, although they talked about fatal wounds being inflicted in the first fight, and then Mrs. MacDonald coming in to discovering Captain MacDonald killing the second child, which at the point the government said he was no longer temporarily insane, but was sane, doing it so to protect his career. That second attack on Mrs. MacDonald was premeditated. So in a sense, I'm not talking about something that does not exist in this case, but rather what the government seems to be telling us about one or two of the killings this morning. Now, what I wish to point out is there are a number of enormous discrepancies in this logic of the kind of theory. And the first theory I will categorize as the weapons that were used. Now, the reason why I think this is a discrepancy falls into a number of different points. Now, first of all, the number of weapons that were used. There were 4 weapons used by Captain MacDonald in his sanity and premeditation to commit these crimes. And a matter of fact, not only were there 4 weapons used, but it appears 3 or 4 of the weapons were used almost in every instance on all persons. That is, I think you will find that 3 of the dead persons, that each 2 of the dead persons had 3 different types of injuries from 3 different instruments. One had 2 injuries on her, meaning that they were 8 separate acts committed against those 3 persons. That is not the only use of the knife alone, but a knife and a club and an ice pick. 2 knives, a club, and a combination of others, but in fact there were 8 separate weapons used against the bodies. Plus, the fact that Captain MacDonald had 3 weapons used on him. In other words, a minimum of 11 separate weapons were used. In an odd kind of situation. Now, what in the name of the logic of the premeditated intelligent MacDonald was that done for? Well, one might conceive the possibility that they were done to mislead any investigators for the purpose, considering that there were many people involved in that attack. That perhaps a reasonable possibility as to the 3 weapons, as to the ice pick and 2 knives. It's an unreasonable possibility as to the use of the club, because the club in and itself is not likely, under any conceivable circumstances that we know, in this case, to have produced instantaneous death. And since we are dealing with a calm, cool, collected emergency room type who is very bright, knows that the killings are virtually over his head, and the pencil shoots are clearly within a earshot of his home, that there are other people at home. And therefore, one does not commit an assault when one is seeking to escape all the consequences of it with a weapon of which is not all assured of producing instantaneous death, but to the contrary, requires clubbing to death of an individual with consequences of screaming and yelling, which in fact witnesses did testify to having been heard. It doesn't make any sense. Another reason it doesn't make any sense is that the efforts by this intelligent man require him to manipulate 4 different instruments. He cannot carry them all together. He can't use them. He can't logically hold 3 in one hand or 1 in another. He has to put some down, and when he's done using the other instrument, get another instrument when he is done using the 2 instruments in some cases. In the case of these bodies, to use a 3rd instrument, how does he carry them? Does he put them in the waistband of his pajamas? Does he do any of these things? What does he do at the club? None of these things seem to make any reasonable sense. I mean, we could fantasize to the nth degree, but if we take the government's approach and say we are trying to develop the nature of the defendant, the nature of the accused as being an intelligent man, that he was doing a premeditated act here, a calm, sane act, it is inconsistent with those things to pick up, first of all, 4 weapons, accomplish the acts, and secondly, of the 4, to also include it in the use of the club. Now, the point I want to make now, sir, is in the regard of this theory of the government. The Captain MacDonald has used 4 different weapons. I want to now address myself to the point has been made in the opening remarks. First, on the date of these proceedings by the government counsel, that they were going to do. Prove that the weapons came from MacDonald's home. And so, on this particular point, I've devoted an enormous amount of energy, and I can say with perhaps more certainty than almost any other single fact I can think of, that with the exception of a piece of wood, that there is not the slightest evidence that the 3 cutting instruments, the ice pick, the 2 knives, have any way, shape, or fashion, form, been implicated or identified with by the government within the MacDonald house. As a matter of fact, we do have an additional problem here. The unidentified fingerprint on the kitchen cabinet, the kitchen counter near the door which the utensils were kept. Now I make reference to the unidentified fingerprint to suggest to you, sir, that if Captain MacDonald was getting weapons through his own supply in the kitchen, that he either leaves no fingerprints because he has deviously contrived all the weapons at all the times to wear rubber gloves, or if some other person has gotten those weapons, it is the person who left the fingerprint. That's not identified, but then it means it's not Captain MacDonald, and if the government is right that the knives may have come from the MacDonald house, although we specifically deny it because Captain MacDonald and no one supports the theory as they said they would, or proof they did come from there, then you have to put the unidentified person in just a position which would seem to lead to a reasonable interface that somebody would have gone into that drawer, but then it would not be Captain MacDonald. So it seems to me the government is on its horns, is on the horns of a dilemma here. If it accepts the unidentified fingerprint theory that the knives were in the house, then that relates those together and relates to Captain MacDonald's story. If they take the position that there were no other persons, then they haven't proven that Captain MacDonald handled those weapons. I am a little disappointed this morning that we do not have the weapons here, because I wish to make certain observations about the cutting instruments, and the investigating officer, I would assume, would be at liberty at the conclusion of the arguments or some other time that is convenient to examine these. Whether in fact in his own observations confirm or deny what the counsel for the accused suggests, it is my recollection that on rather close scrutiny of the particular cutting instruments, 2 knives, and one of them showed on its surface that had been scraped against concrete, sidewalks, or stone. That it showed the kind of abuse and stretch marks on both sides. It had not been used in a conventional kind of kitchen fashion, nor had it ever been sharpened on a cutting stone or kitchen sharpener. Now, what else is there to suggest that Captain MacDonald had a knife of any sort that was in that type of condition? That is, the investigators of this case have observed the condition of the knife. This knife, which I think is fair to assume that was clearly sharpened on a pavement or stone. Whatever utensil in the MacDonald household had been abused in that fashion, whatever utensils had come to the attention of anyone in that fashion. Now the ice pick, we examine the condition of the ice pick. The ice pick appears in all judgments to be a new type of acquisition. That is one which has not been used very much. It does not show signs of abuse on it. There is not the slightest evidence, and that the government has stated in its opening remarks it would show that these came from the house Captain MacDonald or Mrs. MacDonald, that Captain MacDonald or Mrs. MacDonald ever acquired such an instrument. What is it that the government will suggest it is going to prove then? Did it say we could prove one or two, that is two of the knives came from the house, and that ice pick is a new acquisition that no one knew about? No, the government did not say that. The government made no caveat and restriction, and it said its opening remarks it would prove in this inquiry that those knives, along with the cutting weapons, came from the MacDonald house. You have a weapon which is, I would characterize as an abused one, which doesn't seem consistent with anything you'd find in the house. You have a weapon, and the ice pick, which no one had seen, an ice pick in the house. It is assumed, of course, that they were paring knives to be found in that MacDonald house, but these are denied as of ever being there. In other words, you have no way of tying the weapons together with the MacDonald family, with Captain MacDonald, or the MacDonald house. Now, I want to mention here, in this point, with the inappropriateness of what I call, and I've already in a sense referred to it, the selection of weapons, and I refer specifically to the club. It seems to me it's a very significant observation to be made from this, that the concern of the premeditated killer that is the one who takes into the account the fact that he does not want to be uncovered, that he is committing his crime in a densely populated residential area, in which his apartment at 544 Castle Drive was located, would not in any conceivable logical, intelligent, or sane fashion pick to use a weapon, as I said, therefore, that would produce lingering pain before it could possibly inflict enough blows on it to inflict death. That is, the club would not be instantaneous death. Again, if we presume we're dealing with an intelligent, sane doctor, he knows that the knife, a single thrust, could be delivered to a vital part. He knows that a thrust in the heart would cause immediate death. He knows that a wound to one or two other organs would produce instant death, and almost no possible outcry, and therefore protect the premeditated sane killer. None of that is appropriate here. Now, there is one other kind of aspect about this weapon, and should be considered, and that is again relating to the number of weapons that there is. Because of the large number, there is, for a sane man, the real problem of having difficulty of discarding the weapons. Now, if you use a single weapon, the opportunity to discard it is much simpler. Now, one of these things that troubled me about discarding the weapons was that they weren't really discarded. In fact, as a subpoint, I would suggest to the investigating officer, why weren't the weapons hidden? That is, the sane killer would prefer to project whoever investigates the fact that the unidentified individuals came in, they committed these terrible events, and they escaped, taking them with them, the weapons. Why would they leave them there as such a clue? Would they leave them there for someone to speculate whether MacDonald had gone into his own kitchen door and taken two of them out and brought an ice pick? He had brought a piece of wood, which would perhaps be identified to his own house because of the paint on it. Why would he use those instruments, which would possibly turn the finger of suspicion to himself, at the very same time a sane, competent, and trying to project the idea of people fleeing? He wouldn't have taken them outside. As a matter of fact, they might have even hidden the club laying out in the club laying out in the back, in the grass, in plain view. The knives, I think, are relatively in plain view. I think only the darkness of the hour prevented immediate location of the weapons. There certainly was no great effort to hide them. One could readily conceive that the killer, using a single weapon, throwing it down a sewer where it wouldn't be found, a single turn of the spade will lift aside to place a small bladed weapon, push the sod down back into the house, and then you have shown, well, MacDonald couldn't have killed them because there he is. He's wounded, they're dead, and the weapons aren't there. Therefore, the conclusion would be the weapons are removed, or if MacDonald must retain one other weapon in the house to injure himself, why at least the club? Why not mislead him? The club seems so relatively identifiable to his house. There's a number of there's more lumber around. There's the paint on it. It isn't even a fresh piece of wood. Why an intelligent killer who goes around and buys a new ice pick goes out and gets a piece of lumber which is identified within his home? It is not consistent with any suggestion that a sane, intelligent man committed these crimes. Now, the third thing that troubles me about the sane, premeditated killer is that the schedule that we used. And it was certainly, ultimately, that no sane man could have produced this kind of plan. No sane man could have produced this kind of plan. First of all, you have to consider the bringing in of the club into the MacDonald house. Now, in that regard, we might suspect that perhaps there was premeditation. He'd gone out, brought the club in, secured it someplace in the house, and then brought it out to use in the killing. Because one would find it difficult to imagine the housewife all day in a very small house of this sort, finding a rather unusual, almost 3-foot long club there. And you have the assembly of the multiple weapons, the time involved in getting the other weapons together. It seems to me that Mrs. MacDonald was in bed. We do know that the best that Captain MacDonald in the premeditated killing would have available to him at the time between when either the government council accepts the idea of something happening around 2 o'clock, as they believe, as Captain Mac, or as what Captain MacDonald has said what happened. But somewhere in between 2 and 3, the actions of the premeditated murder had become initiated. That is, he had to start, either bring the club in, or if he already had it in the house, bring it out where he could use it and gather the other weapons together. He has to assume, if he is going to use the club, that he does not have a lot of time available to commit the murders. Why does he assume that? Because he knows that the single blow will not kill, or can assume anyway. He does not know, he cannot assume that a single blow from a club will completely demolish the life of his wife or the children without the screams. And he knows that the Kalins are in reference to his house. And he knows the Pendleshooks are. He knows the intensity and density of the development area. Certainly the premeditated killer does not run the risk of using weapons in a closely knit time, which will bring outcry, perhaps before he is ready. Because what does he have to do next? The next thing he has to do after he has assembled them and used them, and he has to assume that if he used the club, that there may be some possibility of noise that he has to dispose of them. Now this case disposal would have had to require Captain MacDonald to go outside, place from some outside position the 2 knives under the bush, a stick outside and come back inside while he has done this. Highest probability of certainty to think that a sane man would think after I struck somebody with a club there's a possibility of screaming. That is the moment somebody is most likely to look out the window, as what has happened repeatedly in this case. People looked. People were awakened by unusualness of the sounds. So the time schedule just doesn't seem to make sense that you'd use a club. You'd have to do all these things to get ready. If you use the club, I suggest to you really interject here so that that you're going to have to dispose of it by going outside. There's at least on the back concrete steps of his house to do it, exposing himself to view, exposing himself to the possibility that someone would see him outside. And then how would he explain that? And then, of course, he has to engage in the scene staging. Now, I'm going to give the killer, a sane killer, credit, sir, for having done the living room in advance. That is, I would assume the sane killer is going to stage his getaway before he went in to attack anyone. Carefully arrange the living room. That is conceivable, mostly. And it is rational for a person who is intelligent and premeditated to work that out. However, it is impossible, sir, to prepare the bedroom in advance because we know there are all sorts of items that were disturbed. There were all sorts of things that were moved. There were sorts of movement of the sheets, the blankets. Things that had to be done afterwards that could not have been done in advance of the attack. So the killer had to do it after the use of the weapons. As a critical time factor, assuming that the other things easily before the attacks, including the possibility of the outcry, worrying about the outcry from the people who were struck with the club, dispose of them outside of his house, then finish scene staging, giving credit for having done the living room in advance and prepare the movement of the bodies is the sixth step. Now he still hasn't, however, accomplished his scheme by treating with his own injuries, and so therefore, as part of the scene being staged, he has to go ahead and inflict his own injuries. Now, this is a situation in advance. Could anticipate using a club, would produce outcry. These are all steps he's going through in regard to the time of this case. Now, I suggest to you just that kind of analysis that one is a little hard-pressed to see that a reasonable, intelligent man would invent that kind of scheme and carry it out in a sane, premeditated fashion. Now, I want to take for a minute a separate form of analysis. The whole business about the scene staging. Now, if I may ask for your indulgence for one moment, I want to make reference to note here the stabbing of Colette through the blue pajamas. In other words, what was articulated this morning was done for the purpose of conveying the impression that perhaps those wounds, those holes in the pajamas, were made when Captain McDonald himself was attacked. That was done for a purpose of creating an effect. However, the very discrepancies, sir, found, if you recall the testimony of the physician who performed the post-mortem, that there was no blue fibers, in fact, in any of the wounds. That is, the incised wounds made into Mrs. McDonald's body, allegedly under the theory of the morning, now stated by the government through the pajamas, failed to leave the slightest thread. And since the pajamas makes a great point, and since the government makes a great point about the threading and capacity of the pajamas, how it is staged, how it is, if that was staged in the fashion the government suggests, they said apparently MacDonald was very sloppy about the whole thing, because he left the fibers under the child's fingernails and he did a lot of other sloppy things. So we would not think that he cleaned out the wounds of the knife in the various places where it was allegedly punctured through the pajamas for the purpose of staging. It does not exist that way. Now, staging and other discrepancies. If part of the staging was to don't use an instrument in his own house in rubber gloves, and most of the rubber gloves cannot be found, how is he grossly negligent as to leave pieces that are found rather easily, or as if he disposed of his own rubber gloves and pulling them off? He knew that the thumb was missing and the tips and the fingers were missing. It wasn't as if it was a fact that he could have been overlooked, that it could have been overlooked in the bed clothing, and it should have been produced the way furious searching for this, because the rubber gloves could conceivably be related back. Why was that left there intentionally? Why was that piece left there when it was difficult to, not see? Seems to me, if the plan of the San Intelligent Emergency Room college trend man, that we really misapprehend the nature of the beast which we are dealing with. Now, I want to make one other reference to the rubber gloves. There's no surprise about the rubber gloves. The CID questioned Captain MacDonald on the 6th of April about the rubber gloves at page 27 of the transcript. So they have known. In fact, they obviously questioned him on April 6th about the rubber gloves and had reason to believe that the rubber gloves were missing from the house. That is, if they had found the pieces at that point, which they had, and they were questioning MacDonald, but up until then, they had never talked to him about it. They knew at that point pieces of gloves might have been missing from the house, and that is, the gloves were not found on the kitchen sink. That was the surgical gloves, the gloves that were not found in the utility room, all missing. And where's the explanation for all those? That fit consistently with the idea that MacDonald in this scene was staging. Managed to leave pieces of gloves around, out of the very type of one would associate with him, as opposed, for instance, buying a pair of 29-cent canvas gloves, which achieved the same effect. I suppose the government will argue he wouldn't use handyman's gloves, because it's so much better for a sturgeon to stab his family with those rubber gloves, because he can feel the knife so much better. It defies what we are talking about. I'll say those kinds of scene staging are really on the absurd point. Now we get to the coffee table in the living room. Generally, the scene staging now, as far as the sentiment made this morning by the government counsel, that the table doesn't wind up on its edge. Apparently the answer to that depends on who is experimenting, or the experimenter in doing it. However, let us assume Captain MacDonald staged the scene in the living room. Now we are talking about an intelligent, bright man, a reader of mysteries, for whatever that's worth. With the magazines and other things, if you are attempting to stage, and I am thinking out loud, simply a person who has never committed a homicide, a premeditation fashion of any sort, it seems to me the staging of the scene, the natural inclination, the natural assumption is to make it appear of a great deal of activity taking place. Not to minimize the amount of activity in the living room. Not to make it appear as though very little happened, although one claims to be stopped there, but really to build it up a little is to add a little bit of theatrics to it. Seems to me the elementary thing is to strew the magazines around in that section of your living room. You just throw them. You just pick them up, you throw them in the air. One seems to, if you are staging that kind of event, if you're bright, you don't do what is more apparent. That is, appears the magazines on Now, if he is staging a scene, it seems to me logic requires him to find more credibility in the idea that they fell or slipped off the table. The table is brushed by or pushed by the leg of a man with a club and two other men trying to come in and join the fight. Then the idea of MacDonald just turning it over to not make a great effort to make it appear that a struggle happened there. It seems to me that is the very meaningful kind of discrepancy in the theory of the MacDonald stages the crime scene. Now, in addition to this proceeding, the scene staging the feigned injuries, so-called, we have here, so 5 doctors have given the qualified opinions of feigned injuries. First 2 doctors were Straub and Jacobson, who, I remind you, the investigating officer, were called by the government that both Dr. Straub and Dr. Jacobson said in the government's case, and therefore is part of the government's evidence that in their experienced judgment, one of them being a surgeon, the other one being an emergency room treating physician, that in their clinical judgment, in their evaluation of the medical colleagues in general, in their evaluation of the intelligence of Jeffrey R. MacDonald, no doctor knowing what MacDonald knows would inflict, attempt, or offend injury, the wound to the lung, which was inflicted in this case, in the place it was inflicted, because I think it really fleshes out, to me, it is one of the largest single phrases in this case. It is worth some weight, and I will use the abbreviation for the full statement by saying he could not know the medical consequences of an injury inflicted at that point. Then why does the sane, intelligent MacDonald have to be assumed to then done the insane, unmedical, intelligent thing of an injury to a place which is so outlandish for the doctors to say he cannot tell the medical consequences of doing that to yourself, that all the doctors in the first 2 categories said there are numerous other places of which, at least to a layman, is that thinking about throwing off investigators, throwing off the detectives would seem rather serious. And what is the other places in the stomach, in the abdomen area, the stomach area, which would seem graver than they really were, but which had no problem as far as being unable to anticipate the medical consequences, what they would be. Then you have the added to not only the government's 2 doctors, you have 2 surgeons that came here on behalf of the accused, Dr. Monson and Dr. McGann, and tell us that his surgeons concur, and they tell us as surgeons concur entirely with the government's witness that a doctor would not inflict an injury at this point. By the way, one of the things that sticks in my mind about this subject is government counsel made a rather gruesome moment, and as Dr. McGann, I think it was, well, couldn't you do this in being aware of the danger of medical consequences and slip the knife ever so slowly into one's body to make sure you didn't reach the liver or maybe even the corner of the heart? Dr. McGann witnessed and said, no, you couldn't do it. It wouldn't make any difference because you can't tell what's the moving and breathing, the liver, because you can't tell where the moving, the liver is going to be at any given time. So as far as that, it seems to me overwhelming medical testimony from both the government's qualified witness and the defense's qualified witness that this would not be an injury MacDonald could, if he was in his sane mind, intentionally inflict upon himself, because it was so utterly dangerous, possibly fatal, that he was not trying to dispose of himself as anyone believes. Therefore, it would not be the place to do it. So as far as Dr. Fisher is concerned, he clearly contradicts the government's own doctors. I can only say that his error in terms, as he used his own words, being misled by the information been given to him prior to coming into this quarry as to where the wound took place, where the wound actually entered Captain MacDonald's body. This substantially places doubt, I think, his judgment in this matter. It seems to me this failure to actually come out and 100% concede, that error, however, reflects upon the fixed of this position. I don't think that he took a very factual position with us. He did not really, although admittedly shown the fact that he was 5.5 inches wrong about where the injury was. And that, in fact, although he quite correctly said right, lower hand corner, here, you can't hit the diaphragm. You can't hit the diaphragm and the liver. You don't touch the corner of the heart. But he had to concede that over here, where Captain Dr. MacDonald's injury was 3 inches off the mid-sternum. With that injury, those organs were in danger. Dr. Fisher is, as a pathologist, deals with dead bodies all the time. Apparently did not think that was the kind of injury that all other doctors thought it was. In my judgment, unbalanced, the conclusion that a reasonable investigator would arrive at is that one would find very difficult to attack the motives of Straub, McGann, Jacobson, Manson. A fourth came in and lied, or the 4 are medically wrong. And the only Dr. Fisher, who was so overwhelmingly accurate, should be considered as outdoing them. I am not impressed with I'm not impressed that way. I really don't feel that Dr. Fisher's testimony merits the rejection of the other witnesses, and in doing so, I am not rejecting that testimony. It places extreme doubt on the concept of a feigned injury. Now, I also want to take just a couple of other, what I think are relatively minor points in this regard to the staging of the scene and to the inconsistencies in the theory of the sane man. I am very much concerned as to why, if Dr. MacDonald was sane at the time and premeditatedly he pelted Kimberly with the club, because I would think, if you knew anything about MacDonald, that's just doing in his children, I would find it a little hard to believe that he'd take long to slow the process. He had all the knives around. Obviously, he carried 3 knives in one club. It doesn't seem to require much to expect him to take one large step to grab the child and to do her in with the knife. I mean, why would he? Batter her in the same kind of position. Where is anything at all in this case to support the concept of MacDonald? Anything at all in this case to support the concept since the age of 14 MacDonald has ever treated Colette MacDonald with the kind of violent force assault as was manifest in this case. Where is each of the evidence? Where is there any evidence in this case whatsoever from the date of birth of each of the killed children, from any witness, that Jeff MacDonald ever treated any of his children with any form of physical violence? Where is there anything at all to support the sheerest kind of speculation of the part of how MacDonald, if sane, would have treated his children? And in any part of the theory, in one theory this morning, sir, that MacDonald was sane when he killed the second of his children. and that MacDonald was sane when he, in fact, innocence polished off his wife by killing her when she walked in during the killing of the second child. What is there ever to show that MacDonald resorted to this kind of outlet? To the contrary, sir, evidence of 12 individuals, 2 psychiatrists, overwhelming files in the face of the kind of assumption, of guess, of hypothesis, of speculation, as to make it really unworthy of very serious consideration. There just isn't any basis to this. None at all. No basis. What the government has announced this morning is their theory is that MacDonald worked out some sort of problem so trivial that it offends the mind to think that because of the bedwetting, we are supposed to believe that these killings, the first 2, impulsively, and then one deliberately in a cold heat that took place, and there is not a single word of evidence that in the 13 years within the span of MacDonald's life, and Alfred Kassab, who knew him at the age of 14, to the age 27, and all of the people fit in the bits and the pieces of his life, that he has ever behaved this way to his children, to his wife. It is the total absence, at the least, of physical violence. That is the characteristic of MacDonald. No one in the world has ever said that MacDonald didn't, chastise his children, didn't discipline his children, didn't disagree with his wife, didn't have the normal kind of relation. In the relationship, their normal way, where mine might be to yell, sir, but not to strike. His would be to talk and talk, but he did not choose to yell because he was not consistent with his personality. Nor is there anything to support that kind of conclusion that happened. And the final thing is I would want to add in one more theory, sir, is that if he is the absence of motive of intentional, deliberate killing of his entire family, of course. Since the government discounted that, sir, that they don't exist, that they don't insist that there was a premeditated killing of all 3. I don't mean to belabor it. I do say, sir, that will be my argument throughout the reference to the other couple of theories I want to mention. That there is something that actually is frightening to be considered, that as an investigator would seriously take the premises that MacDonald family was wiped out in this incredible fashion because of the wetting of the bed, provided they knew what they must have. Provided they knew what they must have. Known that they must have known now, and certainly now, about the family. That is, I am certain this is not beyond the ken of some individuals, albeit a rather bizarre type of person, a rather strange person to get so carried away with a family disputable bedwetting that perhaps could lead to a great tragedy. I mean, I say with its conceivable, but, and if you had some history, some indication, one would begin to look deeper into this theory, but the absence of any motive that one can really place faith in, the absence of motive that the investigating officer would say, rings true in the context of MacDonald, rings true in the context of most human beings, rings true except in the context of some very rare, irrational person, of some very rare, irrational person to me, puts the final kibosh, if I may use that term, on the theory number 1. Now, theory number 2, I would say, MacDonald killed 3 persons. He was insane, and that is that he did it, and did it all 3 of them in. But he was insane. This theory is a little easier to dispense this theory is easier to dispense with than the premeditated one. That is probably more objective information to deal with than MacDonald's sanctity. We have almost any other single subject. I have a record of which is quite impressive, and I think it's quite helpful in that regard. That, as a matter of fact, I should add to the theory. I'm sorry, let me strike. I meant in that fashion to say at this point MacDonald didn't do it in a premeditated fashion. At this point, that MacDonald did not do it in a premeditated fashion. He did it on impulse, without thinking about it in advance, and that he was sane. And when he did it, the insanity I will treat in the third theory. It seems to me that the impulse again is the very beginning to very quickly would not really be a thing. But again, taking some analysis that MacDonald killed his family while impulsively acting on anger, but he was sane when he did it. How do you account for the use of full weapons? That is, the impulse killer ran outside, put the stick in, because we now know there's no evidence in this case that there was any unused lumber inside the MacDonald household at all. So therefore, the basis to assume is that he would have had this stick lying around for the impulsive killer. There also the fact that there is a multitude of weapons that are not identified within the house. Let's assume everybody's absolutely wrong, and all three of the cutting weapons were in the MacDonald house, wherein the impulse does one gather up the multitude of weapons. Does that seem to be an impulsive way a sane man acts? Or does the use of a single weapon seem more appropriate in acts that one that acts on impulse? That is, the gathering together of an arsenal in either a premeditated scheme whereby there's an attempt to delude investigators, or is it the insane scheme of a killer who rounds up many weapons to do the killing? This insane premeditation, this is the insane premeditation that is working out. But the middle theory of the impulse of the sane man, just because he became outraged, just because he got frustrated, because he just worked out his hostility in a little exercise of triple homicide, a triple homicide murder, does he gather together 4 weapons, one of them which had to be outside of the house, the other for which no one could find any support of having been in his house. And why does he even need 3 or 4 weapons for an impulse killer? Why would an impulse killer need that? Why would somebody killing on an impulse need that? Now, if it's an impulse killing, how does he come to have rubber gloves on? I mean, what is that? What is impulse about that? Putting on rubber gloves to save fingerprints. That doesn't make any sense with the term of an impulse. But the minute you start talking about deliberation to avoid being caught up in the responsible party for a given crime, you have to X out the word impulse. You are back to the same premeditated theory that we have talked about and I think adequately analyzed. Now, if we talk about the impulse theory, how do we account for the fact that Colette MacDonald was likely clubbed first because of the indication of the broken forearms? It would seem to me, if one believed she was shielding her face, or a person shielding a child, perhaps, this would indicate that after the impulsive clubbing had taken place, and Captain MacDonald had no longer impulsively acted, he then went and got the knife and stabbed her again. It doesn't seem very consistent or it is very difficult to imagine the impulse being one that gathers up an arsenal that goes back to the sane premeditation theory type of question in this case. If it's an impulse killing, why are there multiple injuries on Kirsten? If the first killing, Colette was stabbed, why do the first killing, Colette was then stabbed, why do we have a repetition of this pattern? Does the impulse continue indefinitely? Does the impulse last and go from room to repeat these things? It seems to me that we do not have any way of concluding that a sane man was impulsively gathering groups of weapons, putting on the gloves to throw people off, then clubbing Colette. You assume that this was an impulse killing, then you are talking about what happens after the killing, in which you are talking about what happens after the killing in terms of the amount of time available to MacDonald to now prepare a delusional covering, or to prepare for a fake scheme to mislead people. Now we know that if MacDonald impulsively killed his wife and screamed out, and if he was sane, he had to do it and know that from the point very clearly the Kalins and the Pendachuks could hear and the others could hear the screams, it means he had the time to conceive a scheme to cover the whole thing. First, he had to get rid of the weapons. He had to move the bodies. He had to stage the scene in the living room. He had to inflict injuries on himself. He had to dispose of the rubber gloves. And do that, all awareness that the military police must have been called. He must do that all with the awareness that somebody was bound to hear it. He must conceive that the whole thing, in the limited time that was available between the time of the impulse killing and to concoct the scheme, sir. Seems to me that the elaborateness of the government theory requires one to feel that the scheme had to defy belief. To really defy belief. And those things that happen after the impulse killing here. Now there's been other things which I think perhaps in a very large fashion demonstrates the idea. Oh, and by the way, I really want to add to this part in the impulse disposition afterwards to go outside too, because that's the part of the business of getting rid of the weapons, going out of the house. But then what really I think puts the clincher on that idea is that MacDonald did this impulsive act is unanimously and is the unanimous psychiatric opinion in the case that there is an absence of psychiatric history. I should further add on the basis, let alone prior history, any bit of present basis to believe of acting out of frustration through impulse acts, particularly the absence of any violence as a mechanism that MacDonald had for acting out for any type of response to the frustration. There's just no history. No, there's an absence of violence. Seems to me, if there was any doubt at all that Dr. Bailey and Dr. Sadoff are in complete agreement, I doubt that. The real tragedy, it is really tragic, by the way, that a layman, and I consider myself a layman absolutely in this category, but I thought I learned a little something from the two psychiatrists we heard in this case, could garble up a obviously technical word to transfer it over to lay language, then push it forward to the investigating officer as basis for making you believe Captain MacDonald would act this way, as I heard this morning. The government theory is based upon, of all things, that he was, and I would really like... The government theory is based upon of these things that he was. And I would really like to give the government's argument its full language if I can. I'm sorry, sir, I can't put my finger on it. But I would say, to my recollection of the government's argument, was that Captain Dr. MacDonald was going to walk out, this hostility, this frustration he had. Oh, yes, that is because MacDonald, I think it's worthy of repetition here, the government says that this happened because MacDonald was action-oriented. Well, sir, there couldn't be anything clear in my mind, and I trust that it is clear to everyone else who has been here and has heard the two psychiatrists, and if one did not hear the two psychiatrists, they heard only the investigating officer's witness. Dr. Bailey, the term action-oriented referred to Captain MacDonald, can't in any conceivable fashion be used to say violence. That is, Dr. Bailey went to an enormous length to explain precisely that action-oriented meant it was not killing, but rather it was to undertake and do tasks. If we need to define the word task, I specifically recall Dr. Bailey I specifically recall asking Dr. Bailey, now, you don't mean the task of going out and murdering and slaughtering a family. Dr. Bailey said he did not, and he did not hesitate in rejecting that as a definition of what he meant by task. He meant that he undertook to work in his medical practice, to work on patients, to devote himself to his patients and go out and play basketball, or to orient himself to sports, to undertake and do something. Is associated with all this is normal. The normal kind of response within normal limits is the phrase. That is, we are not talking about abnormal responses to undertake the way you would work out your frustrations with the task of slaughtering a family. I mean, is completely and utterly not in this case. All that it represents is a misunderstanding, a misuse of psychiatric language to twist it and use to the phrase like action-oriented to say, well, he's already action-oriented, and he does, and what does he do when he slaughters his family? I think it is really, I think, a shame that the psychiatric testimony has been misused or misunderstood in that fashion. It is clear to us that there could not have been no impulse killing here of the family on the basis of nothing else other than the psychiatric test, which is unanimous that this man does not work out any kind of life's normal problems like you had, the child in the bed, let alone a greater problem in any fashion resembling violence, in the fashion resembling anything but taking up the normal response, a range of normal emotions that is going out there and working extra hard at your job, going out there and putting a lot of energy into sports activity. We have a third theory that the government investigation should have led into, and I think that is one that seems got a lot of recognition today by the government. It is the temporary insanity part of MacDonald being responsible for some or all the killings in any case. The report was signed by 3 psychiatrists that Walter Reed, and in language says, which I think one would say is equivocal or in any way hedges that Captain MacDonald on February 17th was sane. He did not suffer from mental illness, mental defect, or derangement, and on the form there is not the slightest suggestion, sir, that he had a form of temporary insanity, no matter how you play the language. The government's argument this morning, sir, just says that the man went into a blind, insane rage. They didn't use the word insane just because the government hedged on its own argument, because they knew the witness in the case in this case precludes such a conclusion. It is clear, sir, that the psychiatrists from both sides rejected temporary insanity. There's not the slightest suggestion in the report of the physicians. There's not the slightest suggestion in the report of the physicians held to read that there was any form of temporary loss or of sane conditions, that is, no caveat. There's hesitation in part of the report if it declined to state other things and to other answers and questions. They did not decline on the question of sanity given on the day. There's no motive here, so there's no explanation of how the temporary insanity would come about. We've asked to believe, according to the theory stated this morning, the temporary insanity was a product of a disagreement over urinating in the bed. First of all, it is an episode that happened several years before with the older child. Family, rather proudly, Mrs. MacDonald saying to the other members of the class, being able to feel free enough, secure enough, and as a person that has never been threatened by her husband's medical knowledge, going according to Captain MacDonald, that was his idea that the doctor, the professor in her class, was the appropriate source of information. Where is the feeling that this is an enormous problem? That is that is a problem with the MacDonalds. This utterly defies belief that temporary insanity, in this particular mind anyway, and probably in the overwhelming number of human beings, could not possibly be brought about by the urinating on the bed concept. Now, I do want to say one thing about insanity in this case. We've had some evidence of insanity. As a matter of fact, we've had, I think, 3 instances that I recall of what I think is the insanity of other people in the theory in proximity to this place they're hearing today. One is the story by Mrs. Dahl. 2 is the statements by Mr. Ivory here. And as I say, I do not give the Dahl story any importance in the investigation, except that I do think that Mrs. Dahl's story can be reviewed in any light. This woman's life and her own health were placed in threat over the most trivial matters related to narcotics and drugs. That is her willingness to threaten her own life, that Mr. Ivory is willing to state here, because this woman, Helena Stokely, is involved secretly with the police, and that he is positive and willing to state under oath that he believes her life is in jeopardy. To me, it indicates quite clearly there's no evidence of insanity in Mr. MacDonald, in Captain Dr. MacDonald. We've heard insanity of the greatest type described to us. People who would murder Helena Stokely, would threaten Mrs. Dahl's life. The type of individual we have heard referred to makes perfectly clear that while this insanity may be readily there in many people, contrary to the distinctions to that should be drawn from MacDonald, well, we are not sort of just speculating as to where murder is possible or where murder can be done, but we have a life's history laid out to show us there's no evidence of insanity. There's no evidence of any kind of the background responses of anything that supports the theory of temporary insanity from anyone. I'd also say that there is evidence here of great malice. There's evidence here of rage and anger, the types of crimes committed against the other MacDonalds, that indicates, in my mind, we're talking about insanity of other people. I'd make passing reference, by the way, we are talking about motives and the insanity of others. The testimony of Captain Williams should not, I trust, because it did not necessarily concern hours and hours of evidence in this case. Captain Williams, whose office I think Captain MacDonald was associated with, who testified to what happened in mid-January 1970 as a result of a lecture given to the Special Forces troops about the lack, among other things, the lack of confidential relationship and revealing the activities of abusing drugs when told to doctors. And that Captain Williams testified here, sir, under oath, that he was given the impression and felt generally about the question that some of the men believed Captain MacDonald was a fink. They did turn the man, or was the kind of man, if he had done so, would turn the men in. Who would turn the men in. And I suggest to you, sir, if we are talking about insanity, while we reject it, I think entirely logical theory to proceed on as to Captain MacDonald that remains largely a part of this case, because of what we know of the conduct of the people. Now, there's a fourth theory here, and I want to address myself very briefly. I think the government is insinuating to this theory of the case although it did not state so this morning, and since I do not know whether this is a reflection or record of the case, the investigating officer may want to consider the matter, and that is Mrs. MacDonald was responsible some way in the murders. That is, I will even go a little further and say that she, in fact, under the theory is responsible for the murders of the children and the Captain MacDonald. The Captain MacDonald killed her in response to that. As a matter of fact, the question was in a number of ways raised with different witnesses. I just want to treat it in this fashion. One of the most astonishing pieces of evidence which concludes that Captain MacDonald is responsible for the killings of his family also concludes that Mrs. MacDonald from being responsible in this regard was the evidence by Janice Pendleshock that she heard the three screams, three sets of voices screaming together, and there's absolutely no doubt in my judgment Mrs. Pendleshock in no way impeached, no way was discredited, struck me as being not a hysterical person, but she heard Colette and the children's voices together. Now one might conceive that say that Mrs. MacDonald also, in a Machiavellian way, was screaming simultaneously as she was killing her children. How did she manage to do both of them at the same time? Did she get them both at the same place? Again, one finds it very difficult to establish that as a credible approach to this, but consider another thing. If Mrs. MacDonald did it, you have the problem that was faced with Captain MacDonald doing it. The multiplicity of the weapons being used, again, seems the government presented no plausible basis in the investigating officer. I do not think we'll find in the record of the analysis of any possible basis to believe that Mrs. MacDonald assumed the multitude of the weapons that no one seems to have found in the house. As a matter of fact, there is no reason for anyone to have hidden the fact that she took a kitchen weapon and killed her own family. Yet there is no evidence to support or justify the stance in any way relate the idea of her going about the scheme of bringing those weapons together. Now, if Mrs. MacDonald is supposed to be responsible for this, what about the movement of the bodies? How does one account for her moving the bodies? Why would she? It goes back to the idea that perhaps Captain MacDonald, in his attempt to save face, has rearranged things so to cover up the whole episode of Mrs. MacDonald. But perhaps, to me, most telling is the single factor in this whole story, the theory of Mrs. MacDonald, that what happened to her and what she was doing on 2/16 and 2/17. You have the witness of whom the government never bothered to find, which was Mrs. Krista, the lady who was at the school, the person outside of Captain MacDonald, the last person outside of Captain MacDonald to see Colette MacDonald, who remembers driving her home from school with her that night, who described in the most touching terms, I thought, stopping at the market to buy milk for the children. There's a woman who is about to go home and slaughter them, and being a thoughtful mother, buying milk for her family, so the children should not be without it because it was necessary for the bottles of Christie because she got up at night. And the next thought, the same woman flip-flopping 180 degrees and slaughtering the children. I think that Mrs. Krista's testimony raised such a possibility of them. We have Miss Krista's testimony about the state of mind Mrs. MacDonald, was in. How Mrs. Krista wanted to pursue a sense of friendship with her because she admired her stability. She admired her ability to cope with things. She admired her respect and the love she seemed to be expressing toward her family and children. She admired her ability to cope with things. She admired her respect and the love that she seemed to be expressing toward her family and her children. And she said, when she left Mrs. MacDonald that night, as far as a reasonably perceptive messed up the human being could be. She left a happy and loving woman going into 544 Counsel Drive. I think that rejects that there entirely. We have here, and the government accepted it this morning. The events that took place in the house took place sitting around, talking, and watching the TV together. And one ought to be aware further that there has clearly been eliminated the possibility of some external stimulant having caused Mrs. MacDonald to change her normal lifelong pattern. There's no evidence of alcohol in the system, no evidence of drugs in the system in a way that would affect the kind of condition or change in her. It finally brings us, and I think, sir, to the government's own theory this morning, and that this theory, sir, I find very difficult to see anything more than it represents. Perhaps a fiction writer's idea of a story, but if I were an editor reviewing the plot of the story, I would have to send it back with the suggestion that all of the data that you put into the story out of the people are so utterly contradicts what the people do, that this solution by the fact finder, that the readers won't buy the novel because the reader won't believe that you have given them all the data here and the conclusion doesn't fit it. I think in a sense that one of the most important observations in my mind about this case is that while most psychiatrists commonly take the interview of several hours or even several days about the accused, and they used his life history as written, but Dr. Heller's article, by Dr. Bailey, by Dr. Sadoff, and they all agreed that taking his life history is quite critical, and that while they all use the history and rely upon the events in earlier life of the person to see how he copes with day-to-day life and problems and today's problems, that we did better in this case than any of the psychiatrists can do in his interviews. But we produce such, as I said before, individuals who have been with MacDonald and on the stage of his life for the last 13 years. There's no unaccounted area of his life. There is his young manhood in Long Island. There is his college and medical school activities when he was married with his wife and together with people who have seen them together. We have the views of people in the military seeing him. We have covered week by week and almost month by month how it is psychiatrists, and perhaps that is some fact prior to the conduct, some fact about the outlook, some fact about the violence, some fact about the viciousness between the two people you know have committed. You know, have been omitted and being hidden from the psychiatrists, that no one has come here to give us any further enlightenment to the contrary. I think it is a credit to the psychiatrists who worked on this case that the 15 or so witnesses who have spanned the 13 years of MacDonald's life, that we can give evidence about all and absolutely confirm the observations of the psychiatrists. That is, that every conclusion the psychiatrists arrived at over the weeks in their work have confirmed by the external evidence of 15 witnesses who talked to Captain MacDonald. Now, I don't think it should be viewed as character evidence. These people were really not called by us and did not give character testimony. Character testimony is the kind of testimony in the law that we say a person who has done bad things in his life is really a bad actor. Other people will noise about it. They will talk about it. And therefore, when you ask a witness what his reputation for being a peaceful, law-abiding citizen, it is presumed that the law's presumption is a pretty good one. It has worked 500 years, over 500 years in Anglo-Saxon law and Anglo-American law, and the presumption that a bad actor doesn't live a lifetime without somebody perceiving and talking about the fact that he's got, a background of bad traits. So you come in and you will say, well, I never heard bad things about this man, and therefore we assume that he is not given to bad acts. But we don't have to deal with that kind of testimony, that the character deal with that kind of testimony, that the character testimony, and it's good testimony. But we have testimony so far superior to that it really places it in very extraordinary, high value level in terms of weighing various aspects of this case. I want to suggest that the investigating officer, in the regard that there is a unique span of people who have made these observations. That is, you can fool some of the people all the time, but not all of the people all the time. And one would have to believe that Jeffrey R. MacDonald has fooled persons all the way from Colonel Kingston, who was his superior officer for a period of time, through the nice lady who came down from New York, who was a patient at the hospital, and just because she had enough major operations and he'd seen enough doctors and perceived and watched this man through all kinds of physicians and medical students and undergraduates who served with him, through all kinds of professional soldiers, men with command training, enlisted men with important responsibilities, all of these men, people looking at this man from a really superior variety of angles, having to deal with him at many different levels. Some dealing with him as his peers, some dealing with him as his superiors, some dealing with him as people responsible to him, constantly to point out that the omission of violence, of anger, of hostility, that is what it seems to me shown here through the totality of the psychiatric testimony in this case, that there is no pent-up hostility, no rage, and that the government's argument that this morning seems to boil down to, I would be delighted to hear, because in my own memory, and I have searched it quite deeply, sir, I'm not able to find evidence of pent-up hostility and rage. And if the government stated theory to this investigation that this investigation be recommended that MacDonald be held for court-martial because he released pent-up rage and anger, and that he had it in this incredible outburst, of this torrent of rage. How is it possible that the physicians how is it possible that the psychiatrists are fooled? How is it possible 15 people who all, in different postures, have observed this man over the great length of time and all are deceived by him? People who see him in intimate capacities and in professional capacities, on and off duty, on guard, off guard. One has to find the one conclusion, only if he is, to believe that the government's theory of pent-up rage and hostility, and that is what we have, and that is what we have had, the testimony of a bunch of fools, I guess. People who have served with him in the service, in the medical schools, and knew him as a child are fools, that they have never seen a man holding back tension. They've never seen a man who is living on a powder keg of dynamite. They've never seen a man who's living on a powder keg of dynamite, or who has for 14 years been building up to a single powder keg of dynamite. That we must assume that if we weren't fools, then that many of them were liars, because they've told us of episodes because they have not told us of episodes which he could shed light on that. There isn't any basis for finding foolishness or perjury on parts of the people who have come here of great distances to make personal inconvenience to describe this man's kind of background. And when the investigating officer concludes, which I think the evidence compels one to conclude, that there is no evidence that this man worked fashion, had a lifestyle, and was psychiatrically oriented toward holding bad things inside, bottling up, stopping it up, sort of like a balloon that grows bigger and bigger, then bursts. When you find no basis in Dr. Sadow's testimony of the same kind of balloon that the government seeks to have blown up, this pricks and collapses the way I think the theory of their case must also collapse. In regard to psychiatric testimony, in my judgment, Dr. Sadow, Dr. Bailey are not in disagreement. There's testimony on the records. Dr. Sadow testified very interestingly in response of the questions. I am positive it was the investigating officer's question when you inquired as to why there was a separate branch or necessity of a separate branch in psychiatry known as forensic psychiatry. And I think talking, Dr. Sadow's reply, together with Dr. Bailey, has said that taken together the fact that Dr. Bailey and his colleagues contributed to their own professionalism, sought the advice of a professional forensic psychiatrist to guide them in techniques, have said that forensic psychiatry is in the position of Dr. Bailey, admits many other people are in the position of must make a certain decisions and predictions about people, that in his judgment he would not do so, and that he said he did, and he did not think that psychiatrists should do so. But at no other time did he suggest for a moment, sir, that he found Dr. Sadow to be unqualified, to be in any way distorted. As a matter of fact, it is interesting that Dr. Bailey used the psychological test prepared by the defense in this case. He felt the people who did them to be credible and acceptable. What you really have to hear ultimately when you have Dr. Bailey's testimony as a whole is both of these gentlemen have testified as to the two sides of the same coin, because while Dr. Sadow is willing as a forensic psychiatrist who, because of his professional responsibility, said, yes, I am prepared because it is in my training and my belief I can make a reasonably educated, trained judgment about people and their capabilities to commit horrible violence. Dr. Bailey said well, I don't think I can do that. But sir, if I were to recall just two answers that Dr. Bailey gave on cross-examination, you will find that he will make the ultimate judgment, and he says specifically, he kicked the ball over to the investigating officer. The judgment that he could make was this, that Dr. Bailey, like Dr. Sadow, did not come to find that there was any evidence of pent-up violence. He did not see violence was an outlet used by Captain MacDonald. I specifically wrote the question out for myself. I would know my own formulation to give Dr. Bailey and what I hoped would be the opportunity to at least integrate his testimony with Dr. Sadow's testimony, and Dr. Bailey, in careful thought out manner, that what he used, said that he did not find any evidence that MacDonald walked out problems. That is, that MacDonald had any pent-up violence, or they did things by expressing violence. The same thing Dr. Sadow and Dr. Bailey are on, I think, is in absolute agreement with, is that Dr. Bailey yesterday on cross-examination that said that he did not find any evidence that Captain MacDonald was lying about the events of February 17th. Now, admittedly, and I sort of think it's comical to ask him, it is infallible. Of course, it is not infallible. What he is saying is that we're trained to do this, that psychiatrists know that people come in and try to feign meningitis or feign insanity, but there are many people we have to deal with in that capacity. It is part of their judgment to look for deception, and as a matter of fact, practicing of deception against the psychiatrist is used by him, as I heard Dr. Bailey tell us yesterday, as a measurement of the kind of man you're dealing with. And Dr. Bailey's testimony, as I recall, sir, he said he did not find any deception. Now, he made a very important distinction to which I think that this investigation should pay a great deal of weight to. He did find, he said, a reconstruction of memory for Captain MacDonald, and that he said on details, and some big, some small, some little. I think that the word was used exactly that. Captain MacDonald had reconstructed his memory of those events, and then we asked him what he meant. And he was again, in his own particularly cautiously phrased language, heard by me to say, I don't mean he was fabricating, but that he had a force and attempt to recall things. And to me, sir, that is one of the most significant findings that we will draw from the case for this reason. Now, there's a lot of unexplained facts. There are a lot of things which, no matter how long this inquiry goes on, and we will not be able, without the assistance of people whom we do not yet have before us, and will probably only be by the power of arrest, ever have known the answers to. The point is that if there seems to be any point, a single discrepancy of the two, we are talking about minor matters. Some unexplainable fact about the case. Well, might MacDonald have done something else on this detail? The answer is he might have. There's no suggestion by MacDonald or anyone else associated with his defense or who testified for him that could have happened. There's no suggestion by Captain MacDonald or anyone else associated with his defense or who testified for him that could have happened. But Dr. Bailey explained. He explained that in a normal, and that was the word he adopted, in a normal response to have avoided thinking about the details of the 17th, and as far as we know, aside from the 3 recent interviews in the hospital by the investigators, that not until the CID called Captain MacDonald in on the 6th of April, and Dr. Bailey said he placed a great deal of attention to that fact. It was very interesting, again, the normal response to that kind of a horrible event happened. He told us yesterday, sir, that was reconstruction of the facts, but in no way did he find that there was fabrication of the story. Well, sir, it seems hard to avoid the same conclusion that Dr. Sadoff arrived at. Sadoff found that the explanation description of the events given by Captain MacDonald on the 17th, he found them to also be without deception, without any kind of lying. Now that leaves to one other possibility, and perhaps I think, Colonel Rock, you yourself, and quite at some point of the psychiatrist, could he have done this whole thing in some kind of psychotic stage, some kind of insane stage? Well, the answer of the psychiatrist is likewise answered that question for us. That Dr. Bailey and 2 colleagues, Dr. Sadoff, say that there is no evidence that they can find to support the idea that MacDonald would go into an insane rage. And you have 15 persons from the various spectrums referred to say over a period of 13 years they found no basis to believe that this man could go into an insane rage. They found no basis to believe this man does go into an insane rage. It seems to me that kind of testimony so totally deflates whatsoever small credence could be given to the contrived theory that was explained to us this morning, that on the psychiatric testimony that there is no basis for Captain MacDonald recommending that he be court-martialed. No basis for that. We'll take an appropriate recess so the reporter may rest. The hearing at this point were recessed at 1340 hours on September 11, 1970, which then reopened on
at 1347 hours on the 11th of September 1970. Alright, the hearing gavelled back in, and the hearing reopened at 1347 hours on September 11th, 1970. Colonel Rock opened this up, and Bernie Segal then continues his final and closing arguments. This hearing will come to order. Let the record reflect those parties who were in attendance during the break are currently in the room. Proceed, Counselor.
Now, there is one last comment I want to make at this junction about the psychiatric testimony. I feel one of the helpful aspects of the investigation that we had, and that, again, I would rely upon Dr. Burley's discussion yesterday about the reconstructed testimony, reconstructed memory, on the part of Captain MacDonald. As I said before, in my judgment, there is conceivably some minor points of difference between that of what Captain MacDonald said on April 6, 1970, when he spoke to the CID agents, and they told him to come in on the pretext of talking about his furniture, and the given testimony in these proceedings. And again, I think it is undisputed that there is no one here that suggests for a moment that Captain MacDonald has lied about the idea that he had never thought about the totality, the sequence, and completeness of the events that took place on the 17th of February until he is confronted by the CID on the 6th of April. Again, his explanation for not having done so is that his explanation there, he says, is he put it in his mind, trying to avoid thinking about it, and it was accepted by both Dr. Bailey and Dr. Sadoff as being normal responses, as a normal way of handling the Nymer's tragedy of those dates. Therefore, it has also become significant that it was not until the CID interview taken on a spontaneous situation as far as Captain MacDonald was concerned, without pre-thinking out or an attempt to lay out in chronological fashion the events of the 17th. It was not until Captain Dowsett entered the matter, and shortly thereafter, and directed Captain MacDonald to begin to try and think through a chronologically thorough application, and he did so in an application of Captain MacDonald's mental powers, and he put together the facts of that event. And even so, we know that even that process is not totally free of a recalled process. It's not a totally and even so, we know even then that process is not a totally free recalled process. That he is not able to spontaneously tell us things that happened on the 17th of February 1970, because as the psychiatrist told us, Dr. Bailey said, he had to force up some things, make decisions about what happened. Then I remember taking a drink. I remember Colette taking a Benadryl. Because she probably did, and that's the kind of reconstruction that seems to me should totally and utterly satisfy whatever small question could be raised about the alleged discrepancy or discrepancies on the 6th of April until the time we have heard Captain MacDonald in these proceedings. And again, in trying to evaluate that, one must consider again, and now I'm being redundant, but I think that it is because of the importance of the expertise in this area is not to be underestimated, that our psychiatric experts have said. And if I may be permitted the liberty of putting our psychiatrists into layman's language, they didn't have any basis to believe that Dr. MacDonald lied about what he said on the 17th. Now, we do recognize that the experts have something to offer us. They weren't just here beating the air. And we recognize that their explanation really deals exactly with the problem, perhaps discrepancies. Then we have to say the government theory is that it is constructed around the alleged inability to explain this thing about a phone, or this position about a towel, does not trouble me for a moment. It certainly does not say to me that any standard of law that the investigating officer is compelled to adhere to has been met by the government because the accused seems to have a very apparently remote discrepancy. Now it seems, however, that just taking the government's evidence alone, and I drawled onto the conclusion on that, if you want to say. And I won't look at the second part of the record. In this case, I won't look at anything that the witness for the accused have said. I won't look at anything that the witnesses for the accused have said. You won't have to say that it does by no means appear on its face that Captain MacDonald was responsible for 3 murders. What it appears is we have an enormous amount of unanswered questions about what happened, in a sense that we don't know about some of the details, some of the things happening, in what fashion. No one has explained to us. We have no one has explained them to us. We know we have the deaths. We know we have multiple weapons that were used. We know we have confused circumstances here, but what is clear on its face is readily apparent. Evidence that MacDonald did these things, the readily apparent evidence that the government talks about in its theory that is that MacDonald didn't explain, and other things. In other words, if I may say so, the government's theory is this morning is because Captain MacDonald is still alive, not dead. He must be responsible because MacDonald cannot explain to us satisfactorily to the prosecution why such has happened, or it was not found, or has not seen. He must be guilty. That, sir, is not the legal standard. That MacDonald can't explain away the questions the prosecution wants to ask only by ignoring what the psychiatrists tell us and other people tell us. That MacDonald can't explain why away. Therefore, they have made it clear and apparent evidence rule that says MacDonald has committed the crimes. But I said to you, sir, it is more clear than that you have much more than that. You have, in addition to the government's evidence, the evidence of the accused himself. In other words, the government, if we may draw a picture, is dealing with the scales of justice. And it is their burden to put enough evidence into the weight to raise the scales of justice to a point which says they made a prima facie case. But in this case, we have been allowed to put in the defense evidence, and while I must say on the first time the government has not put the scales anywhere to bring it to the level of a prima facie case, let alone beyond a reasonable doubt, the defense is more than counterbalanced whatever questions, suppositions the government has built on its theory by its own testimony, the evidence. I would say, sir, that Mr. Posey's testimony is entirely intact today and of a normal significance in view of the supplemental interviews of Helena Stokely by Mr. Ivory. It is really astonishing to me, sir, that we could say anything other than the fact that it is the fact hangs out in bright lights that although the local FBI agents who are still here knew that she was fingerprinted, knew that she is brought in, knew that her prints were sent someplace for investigation, say to Mr. Ivory that there is no interview in their files that they took that resembles the story she has told Mr. Posey. The story she said in the presence of Paul Bowman, the story she has told Mr. Ivory. And I do think that we can accept the idea that perhaps some other FBI agents who are no longer available to the office heard that interview because that would be illogical in my mind, because they thought that the local agents knew all about who was picked up locally, who was fingerprinted, and whose prints were sent forward, and don't know the explanation for the whereabouts. It is extremely important, and it seems to me that Mr. Posey's testimony stands so clearly alongside the story. We know from Captain MacDonald in this case that the people, the description, the girl, the blonde hair, the floppy hat, the boots. There is sometimes matters that are just coincidental that happen, but one is defied in trying to understand how Miss Stokely could have anyone believe that one thought she couldn't remember where she was between midnight and 4 a.m. under the influence of marijuana. I would state, sir, again, that Mr. Ivory has stated in his testimony that there is no evidence whatsoever that marijuana in any way impairs the ability to remember. We have Mr. Policy's testimony on different occasions that she told using of different drugs, mescaline one time, which does not affect the memory, LSD another time, which does, in fact, clearly affect her memory. She in no way had, by her statements to Mr. Ivory, we heard in this courtroom without having the cross-examination indicated that she can discount or cause this investigation to discount Posey's testimony. You have Mr. Sutton's testimony of an unusual episode in Rick's bar later on the same night before he was even aware of the McDonald killings, while perhaps Mr. Grebner has told the prosecution, and they have stated to us, no Scotty Sunderland belongs to the CID or perhaps a PMI investigator. There's nobody who sat here and said they found no such soldier on this post who is not connected with the 118th MP Battalion or of some other investigative unit, any other activity, or that there's just a soldier who may have stated what his activities were, but Mr. Sutton told us that he reported it to him. Consequently, to other authorities, that there is astonishing comparison. The candle episode of the clothing of the departure from Rick's bar with a Batman going out wearing a fatigue jacket, all of these things. There's no newspaper stories at that juncture that he had read off or seen, did not know about it until the following day. That all this fits in so consistently to indicate that this investigation has not heard evidence from the government to overcome the defense evidence or witnesses who could have been found by the people who do not have the authority of the police behind them, cannot call upon the Fayetteville police to do errands for them, but you can come out and come up with people, as far as this inquiry knows, that are sane, honest citizens who are at some personal risk will come forward and give us evidence. Does that not serve certainly cast stones in the opposite direction of the scale, away from the possibility of raising the government's case to a prima facie value? Does that not serve certainly cast stones in the opposite direction, scale away from the possibility of raising the government's case to a prima facie level? I think it does. I think it's impossible to discard, and this investigation has aided us in giving us weight to that by obtaining Miss Stokely's testimony through Mr. Ivory. Now, the government says Captain MacDonald left a lot of unanswered questions in this case. I would submit the unanswered questions are the burden of the government's answer to why have you not answered the following matter, sir? To whom does the hairbrush belong to? Whose those hairs were on that hairbrush found in the MacDonald house? How do they explain the existence of the wax spots? How do they explain the fact that 12 to 14 military policemen and Womack Army Hospital must now passed through the MacDonald house like a herd of cattle going back and forth through rooms, and that the only thing the CID found in regard to the travel of those 12 to 14 people were a couple blades of grass, but saw no result of the back and forth travel of the stretcher bears rolling it down the hallway, bringing it in, coming in, walking across the lawn, any wet spots in the MacDonald house with those footsteps. It's perfectly apparent that it is one of the blind alleys that we were led down, because the government could never establish, and they could never very easily, if they thought it was really meaningful, what the weather conditions were. The United States Weather Bureau will be glad to tell us how much precipitation actually there exactly was. It was off and on. But we don't need that, because we have numerous witnesses who describe that off and on rain, not a soaking shower down to the muddy depths of the soil, nothing to indicate at all that one would naturally have found it. Now, maybe we did have that rain. I don't know, sir. I have no way of telling this inquiry whether we had that kind of rain, but the government but the government had the ability to show that there really was a natural consequences of that amount of rain that was there that night. But there wasn't a witness to support it. There was on and off drizzle, and there's no reason to believe that if 12 to 14 MPs and Womack Army Hospital personnel wouldn't leave a wet spot, but could maybe a couple blades of grass, if one is to believe that 4 individuals at the Captain McDonald would leave any more evidence behind them than the 12 to 14 Army personnel. Now, do the unidentified fingers belong? Now, who do the unidentified fingerprints belong to? We've only had a couple. We've only had it through the insistence of the investigating officer, at least a serious attempt to using the facilities of the FBI to answer some of these questions. The FBI report tells us that they are still not able, on the basis of those records, to identify those fingerprints, whether it is the government's solution to that. Does Captain McDonald have to answer whose those fingerprints are, who they belong to? As a matter of fact, we have shown a pattern of life in that house as to the limited number of individuals who are in there. There's no cleaning lady in there. There's no hordes of people coming through there. Does Captain McDonald, his wife, and his children, who do those prints belong to? What is the government's explanation for that? Who moved the pot? Who moved the pot on the floor? Now, sir, the government went to great lengths to ridicule the evidence that is given by Specialist Tavere, a military policeman that they called. Tavere is the witness who testified to an unidentified man coming through the living room, moving the pot, sitting down on the sofa, and getting off the sofa. I think it's unfortunate the attempt was made to suggest it really was one of those stretcher bears from Womack, because nobody has found yet a Womack Army Hospital person who had dungarees that night. And as a matter of fact, the one would have thought that the MPs would have recognized another military person as a soldier. It is also rather strange to think that a medic who has been sent there on emergency call, his vehicle's been lost, so he had to be found by the MPs, and he comes in and sits on the sofa. I mean, that just doesn't follow at all any reasonable interpretation of the facts. Now, the government made great light of the fact that this was ridiculous. Nobody moved the pot. It was part of McDonald's staging, but he didn't do a good job because it was really upright. Not only did Specialist Tavere tell us that the pot was lying on its side, but yesterday the investigating officer marked the statement of Specialist Dickerson. Specialist Dickerson's statement says the pot was on its side and it was consistent with Tavere. And it is consistent with the explanation of how it got to be that way. Let the government explain how the pot got right side up in the various photographs that the CID prepared. I don't know the answer, sir, but I say the burden is not on the defendant, but the defendant is raised into the scales here evidence which casts great doubt on every aspect of the government's theory. In their story of the staging, the pot episode, how do they explain Tavere's statement? How do they explain MP Dickerson's statement? Now, who are the persons that Lieutenant and Mrs. Casper heard at the time of the night in the direction of that they were going? Who did the voices belong to, and why were they there? I don't know what weight, if any, should be given to our lady friend who appeared out here out of the blue and said that her statement was apparently 2 individuals back around February 17th. Whether she did hear voices that night and now she doesn't want to be involved in this matter, disclaims it, but there certainly was evidence other than the record here that at some point there was considerable amount of talk from her that she heard voices also consistent with the Cosmo family at that time. How does the government explain Mrs. Pendleshook's testimony? She heard the woman's voice, the two children's voice crying out at the same time. Simultaneously, when she woke early in the morning on the February the 17th, Mrs. Pendle shook in the curtains that with the testimony of Captain MacDonald heard his wife calling, "Jeff, Jeff, help me. Why are they doing this to me?" And the child's voice yelling, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." And Mrs. Pendle shook in no way being able to be reached by anybody. Be influenced by anyone tells us she heard voices also at the same time. Now, how does the government account for the simultaneous cries of two children and a woman? I had the thought that at some length I would perhaps go and try to answer or sum up the questions the government seemed to raise this morning itself, but I find that such speculative exercise I'll treat just one. The government seems to be very confused as to how Kristen's AP blood came on the Esquire magazine in the living room, assuming that it was her blood. The explanation that makes sense is simply the one that the contamination from the weapons that were used to kill her or to wound her first was the contamination that was contained on the weapons that were then brought into the living room. That is those weapons which are part of the attack on Captain MacDonald that had been used shortly previously to the attack of Kristen, and coming from that assault itself, that the contamination of blood on it, there's no question that's a reasonable possibility of how the blood got on that Esquire magazine. It's a reasonable possibility that stain of blood was on the clothing of one of the attackers that brushed against the table in moving it on MacDonald. As described, the first one, in describing the first one, the first man, and then the others. That is reasonable explanation. It's certainly a lot more reasonable and a lot more logical explanation than the government has raised. But I do not find it useful in any way that I understand to try and deal with the speculation the government has put forth, because their burden in this case is not to make us all go out of here and wonder, about the unanswered question. The burden is to persuade the investigating officer that a prima facie case is clear and apparent on its face. The Captain MacDonald committed these killings, and with their evidence alone, they don't make it. But certainly, with the witnesses the defense has found and brought forth, the witnesses the investigating officer has assisted and brought forward of this own, the government with little evidence they are able to give as hard evidence, the evidence that we can deal with and build upon in a logical fashion till we reach the plateau that says there's a clear prima facie case, maybe not beyond reasonable doubt, but enough to justify a court-martial. None of it is there, and it is pulled away by the counter evidence the rest of us have developed. I've given considerable thought, sir, and if this case were held for court-martial, could do more, could make out a better than they have made it out here in terms of their case, and the inevitable conclusion that everyone must arrive at is the government will have less evidence in a court-martial proceeding than it can produce here in this hearing, because we have permitted a substantial amount of hearsay evidence. We have permitted collateral testimony and the testimony of Mr. Hawkins about what happened on Long Island. A good bit of things were let in here because we were functioning in part in that the grand jury role that this investigation has. But we know the government could not get that in. It would be irrelevant and it would be improper to let it in, and we don't assume that any law officer would allow it to happen. Therefore, having been given the widest latitude to both sides, of course, but having been given the widest latitude that is hard evidence that the government can come up with, that it says it is a clear proof that MacDonald did it, this is a motive of why he did it, that anyone could put any stock to make a decision on it, I don't find in existence at all this particular argument put forth by the government. I was interested in the government's argument, and I will touch just one or two other points on this as to the matter of the strings from the blue garment. Why weren't they shedding all over the house? I have paid particular attention. So perhaps in a very surreptitious fashion, to the handling of that of the garment by all parties here from all time, from the times it was here earlier handed out, moved around from this table to that table to all table, and I have looked at it today when it was handed around. I do not find it on the floor of this proceeding a single thread now, and I will say I didn't find any then either. But anyone who else who says he observed it is welcome to stand up now and say he saw all the threads fall off. The garment was threaded again when MacDonald ripped it from his hands in his wife's room. The garment gave away and then produced those fibers at that time. What is so extraordinary about the fact that the fibers and threads were under her body, MacDonald didn't give a centimeter of measurement of how much he moved the body. He was trying to save his wife's life. He was trying to fight back medical knowledge that she was probably dead. He knew he was looking for desperate measures to find a sign of life. He doesn't know how much he moved her. He checked her somewhat, he lifted her up, and he attempted to provide. He checked back the of her for the wounds. Why in the world would he say that a court-martial will now be held because MacDonald can't explain the fibers? Why does the government explain it? Why can't the government explain it? It cannot show us the fibers in this room. Although we have shook it, we have held it up, we have manipulated that piece of garment in these proceedings, and it is so absurd to talk about MacDonald having to explain the fibers when on the face of it, the tearing of his arm, the crying frustration of seeing her wife's body on the floor should be more than an answer to it. It is answered again by the fact that he treated her as a physician, looking at the wounds in the back, lifting her up, the taking of the garment to cover her up. That seems to me to more than treat the problem. We don't have to even hope to find a single factor or any other little single factor in this case to is whether the government has met the burden of proof. There is no single factor in this case that will produce that answer. And all of the single facts they throw in the scales don't amount to a proof of a prima facie case, let alone beyond reasonable doubt, which would have to be met in a court-martial proceeding. The great point the government makes, and it makes a great point, I noted this morning Captain MacDonald being awakened and hearing the cries of his wife and children, and how did he hear them coming together so quickly? How did he hear them so quickly? It seems to me to be sufficient of this, that there is no suggestion that MacDonald actually awakened instantaneously by the cries. It is a very common phenomenon, and I think probably most of us here have experienced one time or another to have heard a sound in our sleep, then we wake, and I don't mean an hour before we heard the sound. I'm talking about there was a gap between hearing the voices and the sound, making an electrical impulse to the brain, and the conscious act of opening one's eyes and becoming awake. And that is more than possible that this is exactly the occurrence that took place in the MacDonald house, but it is at least consistent and probably more logical than any other theory the government having about MacDonald waking up and instantaneously hearing the screams instantaneously. MacDonald did not say that. I don't know whether he could have said that. If he said it, I'm not sure. I would accept it as an absolute fact because none of us are able to say with certainty that the gap between our hearing knowledge of things that's going on around us as we are asleep and the period of consciousness is finally achieved. So I would say to you only two other things, and I will conclude with my remarks. We are bound by the rule of what the evidence is and must be. It is perfectly apparent that we did not see evidence in the government's case. As a matter of fact, every theory that the prosecution offered in their theories today, one insane killing first, then the same calculated murder to protect the life and reputation, presents so many gaping illogicalities in them. And if I mean, and I mean, they were so bereft of logic, really, to accept the conflicting theories in the case, it is hard to conceive how many meets the legal burden. In my judgment, so obviously I have a biased point of view. I really say to that the investigating officer to consider seriously the only version of the case that substantially explains what happened, albeit not in every detail, is the one that Captain MacDonald is offering. Captain MacDonald's version of the facts, based in part reconstructed recollection, but not deception, not lying, is the only one that doesn't really defy belief. It doesn't insult logical sense or perceptions or the here. It doesn't defy logical sense. It leaves questions, obviously. But MacDonald's not called upon here to prove that he is innocent. Nobody in America or English court does that. The government provides their case beyond a reasonable doubt on trial. It provides a clear and apparent burden here in this hearing. What is clear and apparent about what the government has shown us, it is to me totally defying of the logic to find both the insane killing and a sane killing on the same night. One would find at least expects to find the sanity returning to this man if it was perhaps within the capacity to have had the insane ability. But everything else we know about the man that precludes the possibility when he came to his senses of devising a sneaky, devious, disastrous scheme that isn't part of this man's character. It isn't part of the psychological makeup. To seek to develop some kind of scheme to throw people off track. It just doesn't work that way. On balance, the argument that the government has, or the one that presented today, that these arguments are just examination, let alone the investigating officer will have to show that they are bereft of a logical pattern, that the only version of this case that makes sense without necessarily answering every question is the one that has been told to us by the psychiatrist as not being a deception, not a lie. That is the version of Captain MacDonald. I think, sir, it is appropriate decision under the government's case alone, under the government's case alone, under the defendant's case, with the government's case, under the legal burden which must be met by the government to render a report, but I recommend there be no court-martial in this case. The government counsel wish to rebut to the closing arguments of Bernie Segal.
Yes, sir. Sir, I wish only to take a few minutes now to rebut a few points made by the defense. I think I should first point out that the defense has not only today, in any substantial way, faced the argument or theory of the government. First of all, the defense has forced these possible explanations of what happened on that evening in 4 artificial categories, each one of them having its own shortcomings, and then as the defense calls it, analyzing these theories points out the problems of each of them, has never really faced the fact that the government doesn't use one or any of those theories per se. The government uses an explanation that simply fits the facts. Now I'd like to further point out that the government in its theory has based its arguments on the evidence found in the scene, the testimony of the military police and other people who were present on the morning of the 17th, and the statements of Captain MacDonald. These are all hard evidence. They are not in some way any kind of fancy. I see no real point in dealing with all the various problems of each of those theories because, as I say, we are not dealing with these theories. Why? Why were the 4 weapons used? I think I've explained it why the 4 weapons were used. I think the 2 knives were used because they came from different sources. I think the ice pick was used simply to increase the apparent number of personnel and the apparent senselessness of the type of killing. Why was the scene in the south bedroom in Kimberly's bed, which is Kimberly's bedroom, staged? I don't think that scene in Kimberly's bedroom was staged in the same sense that the scene was in the living room. It's staged only in the sense that why? It's only staged in the sense that the way we find Kimberly is not only the way she was killed or could not have been. Why some other fun things. It's staged only in the sense the way that we find Kimberly's room. It's not in the way she was killed or could have been. Why some other things? Why were the gloves disposed of sloppily? Why were the weapons left strewn about? Because this was not a long premeditated act. It was a series of acts that occurred unexpectedly. Captain MacDonald had a limited amount of time to deal with them, and was not dealing with them in the most intellectual state of mind he's ever been in, and was dealing then with factors so numerous such as the various bloodstains that he could not, or could anyone have reconciled them all at that point, or could not have reconciled them all at the point. Now, I think it's worth talking for just a moment about the doctors and the testimony concerning the injuries that, Captain MacDonald sustained. The defense tells us that the four of these doctors agreed that no doctor would stab himself in this place. And of course, they didn't say that. And I may be misquoting the defense if I may, what they said, but I understand him to be saying that I don't believe that's what the doctor said. I agree that they did say, in their opinion, no one could tell the medical consequences of stabbing themselves in that location. Shall we discredit the testimony of Dr. Fisher? Shall we compare Dr. Fisher with the four doctors who did testify? Two of those doctors, obviously close friends of the accused. Who's Dr. Fisher? What is his occupation? What has he done for the last 21 years? I think these factors have to consider whether his opinion has any value as opposed to that of the other doctors who have spoken on the subject. I would point out that the injuries, if feigned, needed real credibility. It needed it to be an injury, at least one injury, which clearly could have been serious. I think I've explained how this injury could have been inflicted in such a way as a relatively safe and still look serious. As such a way to be relatively safe and still look serious. And the government does not feel necessarily constrained to theorize that these injuries were self-inflicted. We believe they were, but they might not have been. They might have been inflicted by his wife. Now, about the issue of impulse and temporary insanity, the government does not contend here that the accused had a long pent-up hostility towards his wife and children. It's tried to make it very clear that this is not in our theory the way it happened, but this is an incident which occurred out of an argument triggered admitted by an admittedly minor thing, a child urinating the bed, which developed into an argument, then got physical, and at that point, I think it is within bounds to say Captain MacDonald became so angry that he was capable of committing great violence. Now, because the defense wishes to characterize the argument of the government as being one of temporary insanity, in part, I should state that's not the contention of the government. There's a legally recognizable difference between anger and rage and insanity. A man who is blindly angry is not, therefore, of necessity insane. And in fact, if that's the state is not insane, and we contend that it precisely the state that Captain MacDonald was in and seized upon a weapon of opportunity, which happened to be a very large piece of wood or a club, which, as I've said, could have been present for a number of reasons, could even be used to prop up a window. Now let's consider for a moment the testimony of the psychiatrist. I believe Dr. Bailey and his crew have given evidence to this hearing that Captain MacDonald is capable of an act of extreme violence. They also have said that he is capable of hiding this fact from them. Even the source material is proved by the defense would lead them to believe the same thing. So he is capable of these things. Now what about predicting whether he really probably did it or probably didn't do it? From the psychiatric testimony and the psychiatric opinion, Dr. Sadoff felt willing to venture into the word of probability. The defense chooses to intimate. The defense chooses an intimate detail that Dr. Bailey and his team were not forensic psychiatrists. They therefore were not capable of doing what a forensic psychiatrist would do, i.e. venture in to probability, but overlooks the fact that Dr. Rappaport, who is in the testimony of Dr. Bailey, a very famously well-known forensic psychiatrist, has agreed and reinforced the opinion of the military psychiatrists. The world of probability is not the proper realm of psychiatrists. Is Dr. Rappaport without credibility? Is he incapable from this point of view of deciding whether this is the proper area of a psychiatrist to venture? Now the defense says that no one contended that Captain MacDonald was lying, and he said that when he said he had not thought the incidents of the 16th and 17th through prior to April 6th. To set that at rest, let me say I, here and now, say it is our contention that Captain MacDonald is lying when he says that, and it is our contention that he is a man of intelligence, strength, and ability such that he could have, and he did, hide the real facts from psychiatrists to whom he spoke. Now, it's obviously the defense. Now, obviously, since the defense chose to present evidence in this case to the extent that the evidence is beneficial to the government, it has to be considered in that light. So let's not fall into the trap of thinking that the government's case must now, at this point, be judged only on what the government put in as evidence. I'd like to point out a reference to Miss Stokely as a very relevant fact that Captain MacDonald, having been shown a picture of Mrs. Stokely, said he had never seen her before. What about Mr. Sutton? To keep my remarks within the proper dignity, I will say one thing: Mr. Sutton can probably be written off. And as I seem to be wondering, sir, I would just like to say in my own defense that I am trying to follow the order in which these things came out in the defense's argument. We now move to some of the evidence, which the defense did finally get around to saying a few things about. What about the hairbrush? Well, of course, we only have Captain MacDonald's word that it wasn't a hairbrush that belonged to his house. What about the wax? There are a number of candles, many candles in the MacDonald house. One can infer from this that the MacDonalds used many candles, and there was no reason why that wax could not have been from a candle since disposed of. What about the unidentified fingerprints, sir? I say to you that there is no one in this room today into those dwelling could not go and raise fingerprints that we could not identify numbers, because fingerprints will last from hours to months. We know that the defense's testimony that the babysitter, the friends, and the relatives had visited the house. We know that some of the characteristics of Mrs. MacDonald's fingerprints are not in our possession, and so there are some prints which could belong to her, cannot be identified as belonging to her. So I say to you, sir, the unidentified fingerprints in that house are not only odd, but that it would be odd should we have not found such a thing. Now let's consider for a moment the idea presented that the blood on the Esquire magazine was brought in and deposited on that Esquire magazine as contamination from the killing of Kimberly MacDonald, possibly. I say to you this, sir, if that's the case, then Captain MacDonald slipped through the killing of Kimberly. Very odd, most unlikely. Now the defense puts forth the idea that Captain MacDonald ripped the pajama top from his hands. and threw it down, thus disturbing the fibers in the master bedroom. I don't think that's what the evidence shows. There is some evidence that he threw it down. I don't think he described this the process of ripping apart the pajama top. I suggest to you, sir, that's what's still leaving us with this question. What about the pajama pants? When they were they ripped in the struggle? Why don't we have fibers from them in the living room? No fibers in the living room. There's none at all. No great amount of blood in the living room. So, sir, the government presented to you a theory consistent with all known facts of the case. The old, cool facts of hard evidence does not stand up. That theory, that the explanation fails, and I say to you, sir, on behalf of the government, that the only reasonable conclusion which we could see could be reached would be that the decision that Captain MacDonald should stand trial by a court-martial for the murder of his family. This hearing is now closed. They gavelled out. This was the last day of the Article 32 hearings, and it was over at 1435 hours on September 11th, 1970. The end of the Article 32 hearing, the U.S. versus Jeffrey R. MacDonald.